Welcome to the podcast. I hope you enjoy my stories. Today's episode is Blood Rights by James Byron Love. Copyright 2026. All rights reserved. Now let's get into this haunting sci-fi story. Blood Rights. The star was ugly, and Owlantoo had decided that within the first 30 seconds of dropping out of transit. He understood intellectually that beauty in a star was a subjective assessment with no tactical relevance whatsoever. But Barnard's star managed to offend him anyway. A dim, sullen red dwarf burning at roughly 3,000 Kelvin, which was less a stellar temperature, and more the kind of number you associated with industrial ovens and bad decisions. It sat in the viewfield like an ember that had given up on becoming a fire, casting its miserable reddish light across a system that had, against considerable astronomical odds, managed to produce a planet worth inhabiting. "You're making the face," Zorae said. "I don't have a face. I'm looking at navigational data." "You're making the face you make when something aesthetically displeases you, and you're deciding whether it's worth mentioning. It's the same face you made when we arrived at the Varandal station, and someone had painted the docking bay that particular shade of green. That was an objectively poor color choice, and I stand by my reaction." Owlantoo leaned back in the pilot's seat and let his eyes move from the star to the planet turning slowly below it. Bardland, tidally locked or near enough to make no practical difference. One face permanently presented to that sullen red ember, the other turned away into permanent dark, and between them a band of perpetual twilight where something had decided, apparently, that life was worth attempting. "Tell me the target is in the twilight band." "The target is in the twilight band," Zorae confirmed. "Specifically in a settlement the locals designate by a sound that our translation matrix renders as something approximately between a click and a sigh, and which I have taken the liberty of cataloging in our navigation system as Settlement 7, because I refuse to attempt phonetic reproduction of it." "Reasonable." He pulled up the orbital scan data and began working through it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this particular kind of reading. Settlement layouts, patrol patterns, structural densities, electromagnetic signatures, more times than he could be bothered to count. Bardland's twilight band was a narrow strip of amber-lit terrain, caught perpetually in what humans, had they been there and had opinions about it, might have described as late afternoon on a cloudy day. The light from Barnard's star arrived at the surface low and reddish and directionless, the kind of illumination that flattened shadows and made depth perception unreliable. "Zorae, give me the full intelligence brief on the Skriath." "I've given you the intelligence brief on the Skriath. I gave it to you before we entered transit, at which point you read the first third, told me you had the general idea, and spent the remaining transit time doing something you described as reviewing mission parameters, but which I'm fairly certain involved sleep." "I was consolidating information." "You were consolidating consciousness." There was a pause that, on a lesser AI, might have been characterized as pointed. On Zorae it was architectural. She built pauses the way a careful speaker builds sentences, with full awareness of what they were doing. "The Skriath are the indigenous species of Bardland, recognized by the Galactic Council under the Secondary Membership Accord of roughly 400 years ago, which means they have observer status, certain protected rights under Council law, and absolutely no enforcement mechanism for any of it. They are bilaterally symmetrical, vaguely humanoid in overall body plan, and have evolved in low-light conditions over a geological timescale that has given them exceptional low-frequency hearing, eyes with a tapetal structure similar to certain nocturnal species, and a peripheral nervous system that is, frankly, remarkable. Remarkable how? Remarkable in the sense that it contains, distributed across several ganglionic nodes rather than centralized in a single organ, a viral reservoir that the species has been carrying for somewhere in the region of 60,000 years. Another pause. "I did cover this in the brief." "You cover everything in the brief." "The brief is enormous. That's why I rely on you to highlight the genuinely critical elements." "I highlighted it," Zorae said, with a precision that suggested she was choosing each word the way a surgeon chooses an instrument. "I highlighted it in the section titled Biological Hazards, which appeared on the 4th page of the brief, which is well within the first third that you claim to have read." Owlantoo looked up from the orbital scan data. Tell me about the viral reservoir. Now he wants to know about the viral reservoir. Zorae, the Skriath carry a retroviral agent in their saliva and several other biological fluids, which in healthy individuals remains dormant and causes them no particular difficulty. It evolved, as best the Council's xenobiologists have been able to determine, as a predator defense. When a Skriath is under sufficient physical threat or distress, the virus becomes expressible, meaning it can be transmitted through a bite or similar direct fluid transfer. She delivered this information in the measured, unhurried tone she used when she wanted him to understand that she was not going to be rushed past any of it. In most non-Skriath species, transmission produces a viral infection that is well documented, treatable, and something that any competent field operative reading a complete mission brief would have been fully prepared for. And in my species specifically, the virus interacts with certain receptor pathways that are, as it happens, somewhat more susceptible than average, owing to the particular biochemistry of Tanrigel physiology, which I also covered in the brief. The ship's environmental systems hummed steadily around them. Outside the viewfield, Bardland continued its slow rotation, the twilight band a pale amber stripe across its surface. The short version, since we appear to be working in abbreviated formats today, is that a bite from a sufficiently distressed Skriath would be a situation you would want to avoid. Understood. Owlantoo returned his attention to the orbital scan. The target is in Settlement 7. Walk me through the approach vectors. There was a brief silence, and if he had been paying a different kind of attention, he might have noticed that it was the silence of someone deciding not to say something rather than the silence of someone with nothing to say. Approach vectors, Zorae said and began. The target's name was Vescalan, and he was, by the standards of Bardland's political ecology, a moderately significant figure. A broker of information and influence who had spent several decades making himself useful to enough parties that removing him had become, for at least one of those parties, a matter of some priority. Owlantoo did not know which party had contracted the work. He had not asked. He operated through intermediaries who operated through other intermediaries. And at the far end of that chain, someone with sufficient resources and sufficient motivation had decided that Vescalan's continued existence was an inconvenience they were prepared to pay to resolve. This was, as Zorae periodically reminded him, a morally complex position to occupy. This was, as Owlantoo periodically reminded her, not his problem. His schedule for the next 18 hours shows 3 fixed location appearances, Zorae said, overlaying the target data onto his tactical display. The first is a meeting in what functions as a commercial district in the northern quadrant of Settlement 7, which is also the most densely populated area and therefore the most operationally inconvenient. The second is a private residence on the settlement's outer edge, which is more accessible but has the disadvantage of being his home territory where he will be most alert. The third is a location that the intelligence package describes as a place of communal gathering with religious or ceremonial significance, which presents its own complications. Third location, Owlantoo said. You want to conduct an assassination in what is essentially a place of worship. I want to conduct an operation in a location with ceremonial significance, which means the attendees will be following established behavioral patterns, movement will be predictable, and the architecture will almost certainly include spaces designed for privacy and quiet reflection. He was pulling up the structural schematics as he spoke. It's practically purpose-built. I feel like that observation says something about either the nature of sacred spaces or the nature of what you do, and I'm not sure which one concerns me more. She paused. The ceremonial gathering begins at what their timekeeping system translates to approximately 4 hours from now local. That gives you enough time to descend, get into position, and do whatever it is you do while I sit up here and pretend not to know exactly what you're doing. You could come. I'm a distributed artificial intelligence system currently inhabiting a ship computer. My mobility is, as you know, somewhat limited by the laws of physics. You have the remote unit. The remote unit is for emergencies. Watching you work is not an emergency, it's an ethical discomfort, and I've learned to manage that without a physical presence. Another pause, shorter this time. Be careful with the Skriath. They're faster than they look in that light. I'm always careful. You read a third of the brief and called it the general idea, Zorae said. Those two statements are in tension. Owlantoo was already moving toward the descent pod. The descent pod broke atmosphere on the night side and flew low and dark across the Terminator line, crossing from permanent black into the amber half-light of the twilight band at an altitude low enough that anything looking up would have seen nothing but the underside of the overcast sky that perpetually blanketed Bardland's habitable strip. Owlantoo watched the terrain resolve through the pod's forward sensors, a landscape of low, wind-worn formations in colors that the red dwarf's light rendered as variations on the same dull ochre, broken by the geometric regularity of settlement structures that grew denser as he pushed toward the coordinates Zorae had tagged for him. Surface temperature is 12 degrees, Zorae said through his earpiece, her voice carrying the same quality it always had when she was monitoring him from a distance, present, precise, and carrying underneath the precision something that was not quite worry but lived in the same neighborhood. Atmospheric composition is within your tolerances. Gravity is 0.91 standard, which you'll notice in your stride if you're not paying attention. The Skriath evolved in it and move accordingly, so if you want to pass as anything other than an obvious outsider, adjust your gait before you're anywhere near the settlement perimeter. I know how to walk. You know how to walk in standard gravity. This is not standard gravity. It's a small difference, and it will absolutely be visible to any Skriath paying attention, because they have been living in it their entire lives, and their nervous systems are calibrated to it in ways yours is not. A brief pause. I'm not telling you how to walk. I'm telling you to remember that you'll need to. He brought the pod down in a dry formation cluster 3 kilometers from Settlement 7's outer boundary, tucking it into a natural alcove that the sensor sweep had identified as uninhabited and unlikely to attract attention. The cloaking field engaged automatically on touchdown, rendering the pod effectively invisible to any detection technology the Skriath currently possessed, which Zorae had assessed as moderately sophisticated but not a serious concern for his equipment. The air outside hit him as a physical thing when he cracked the hatch, cold and thin with a mineral quality underneath it, the smell of a world that had never quite produced the complex organic chemistry of a fully wet biosphere. Bardland's twilight band was habitable in the way that some places were habitable, meaning that life had found a way to persist there through stubbornness rather than comfort. The light came from everywhere and nowhere, that flat reddish diffusion from a sun perpetually sitting just above or just below the horizon, depending on which part of the band you were standing in. And it did something to depth perception that he registered immediately and filed away as a variable to account for. He activated his shield array at its lowest passive setting, enough to handle incidental contact and minor kinetic events without drawing power at a rate that would be detectable, and began moving toward the settlement. The terrain between the pod and the settlement edge was open and irregular, the kind of ground that rewarded patience over speed, and Owlantoo moved across it with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who understood that arriving correctly mattered considerably more than arriving quickly. He adjusted his stride for the gravity differential as Zorae had suggested, not because she had suggested it, but because she had been right, which was a distinction he maintained carefully in his own mind, and which she would have found both transparent and unsurprising. You're making good time, she said. Vescaland's ceremonial gathering begins in approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes. You have sufficient margin. Tell me more about the gathering itself. The format, the movement patterns, what kind of space I'm working in. The Skriath ceremonial tradition that this gathering falls under involves a period of communal assembly in the main hall of the structure, followed by a period of individual reflection in smaller adjacent spaces, followed by a communal closing. The individual reflection period is where the participants disperse into separate rooms or alcoves, and based on Vescaland's known behavioral patterns from the intelligence package, he uses this period to conduct private conversations that he prefers not to have in more observable settings. She let that sit for a moment. Which is to say that he will at some point be alone, or nearly alone, in a space that is architecturally designed to be acoustically private. I suspect this is why you chose the third location without needing me to explain it to you. I occasionally read between the lines. You occasionally have very good instincts that you then decline to apply to mission briefings. The earpiece carried the faint background hum of the ship's systems, a sound he had been listening to for so long that silence would have felt wrong. The structure itself is single-story, with a central hall and 6 reflection alcoves arranged radially around it. 2 entry points. The materials are local stone and a process composite that reads as moderately dense on sensor sweep, which means your shield will have no difficulty with it, but your cloak will need to be active before you're within sight of the entry points, because Skriath low-light vision is genuinely good, and you will not pass as one of them at close range. What do I pass as at distance? At distance, in this light, with the disguise field active, you pass as something bipedal that is probably not alarming. The Skriath have occasional contact with off-world species through council channels, so an unfamiliar biped is not automatically a crisis for them. Up close is a different matter. A pause. Don't let anyone look at you up close. Settlement 7 resolved out of the amber murk as he crested a low rise and stopped to observe it for a moment before proceeding. It was smaller than the orbital scans had made it feel. A few hundred structures arranged along the logic of the terrain rather than any imposed grid, with the larger communal buildings identifiable by their height and the faint luminescence that several of them emitted, a biological or chemical light source built into the construction materials that gave them a dim glow against the flat sky. The Skriath moved through the settlement's pathways in the particular way of a species that had calibrated every aspect of its locomotion to its environment. Low-centered, efficient, with a slight forward lean that distributed their weight in a way that made sense for their gravity and their skeleton, though it struck his eye as faintly urgent, as though they were always on their way somewhere slightly more important than where they currently were. He activated the cloak and descended toward the settlement. Moving cloaked in an inhabited area was a discipline that rewarded a specific kind of spatial awareness, the ability to track not just where you were but where everyone else was, projecting their trajectories against your own, and finding the lines through the space that kept you out of contact range. Because the cloak handled light and most sensor frequencies, but it did not handle a Skriath walking directly into him, which would be a problem for several reasons. He moved through the outer pathways of Settlement 7 with the patience of someone who had done this on a dozen worlds, reading the flow of foot traffic the way water reads the shape of a riverbed, finding the eddies and the clear channels. The ceremonial structure was in the settlement's interior, and it was already drawing attendees as he approached it. Small groups of Skriath moving toward the 2 entry points in the unhurried way of people observing a scheduled ritual rather than responding to an event. He circled the structure once at a distance of about 20 meters, mapping the actual geometry against what Zorae had given him from the scans, identifying the alcove most likely to be Vescalan's based on the intelligence package's behavioral notes, and locating the point on the structure's exterior where the wall material was thinnest, and his sensors could read through it most clearly. "I'm at the structure," he said quietly. "Scanning interior." "I'm receiving your sensor feed," Zorae said. "Give me a moment." He waited, watching the last of the arriving attendees move through the entry points. "I can identify 11 Skriath inside the main hall and 1 in the far left alcove, which is alcove 6 in my numbering. Cross-referencing biometric signatures against the target profile." Another moment. "The one in alcove 6 is not Vescalan. He hasn't arrived yet." "Then I go in and wait." "You go in and wait," she confirmed. "Alcove 3 is currently unoccupied and gives you a direct sightline to the main hall entry, which is where he'll come from. The wall between alcoves 3 and 6 is the composite material, thinner than the exterior walls, and your sensor resolution through it will be adequate." A beat. "Owlantoo, still here." The Skriath in alcove 6 is very still. More still than meditation or reflection would account for. "I want you to be aware that the behavioral intelligence on Vescalan includes a notation about the use of personal security that doesn't always appear on standard surveillance." He was already moving toward the entry point. "You're telling me he might have a guard in there?" I'm telling you the Skriath in Alcove 6 is very still in a way that is more consistent with someone waiting than with someone reflecting. She paused. I'm also telling you that this notation appeared in the section of the brief that followed the part you read. I'm starting to feel like the brief is going to be a recurring theme. Only for as long as it remains relevant, Zorae said, which at current trajectory may be some time. He slipped through the entry point behind a pair of Skriath attendees and let the darkness of the interior close around him. The main hall was dim even by Bardland standards, the bioluminescent materials in the walls providing just enough light to navigate by, which for the Skriath with their low-light vision was probably entirely adequate, and for Owlantoo required a minor adjustment to his optical augments. The space smelled of something organic and faintly sweet, a ceremonial compound of some kind being diffused through the air from vessels placed at regular intervals, and the acoustics of the hall had been built to carry whispered sound in a way that felt intimate rather than exposed, the murmur of the assembling Skriath folding into a low, continuous texture that covered his movement as effectively as silence would have. He located Alcove 3, confirmed it was empty, and stepped inside. The wait was 23 minutes, which was not long by the standards of this kind of work, and he occupied it by running a continuous passive sensor sweep of the structure, monitoring Zorae's feed, and composing in his head a short list of observations about Bardland that he would not share with her, because she would treat them as evidence of intellectual engagement with the universe that he was, in her view, willfully refusing to apply to his own continued survival. The list included the fact that the bioluminescent material in the walls pulsed at very long intervals, barely perceptible, like slow breathing. He did not mention this to Zorae. Veskalan arrived at the 23rd minute, moving through the main hall with the particular quality of someone accustomed to being noticed and performing indifference to it, and settled into Alcove 6 with the unhurried ease of someone who felt entirely secure in his environment, which left Owlantoo in Alcove 3, separated from his target by a wall of composite material, with one confirmed potential guard and an unknown number of other variables, and the clean, focused simplicity of a problem that had been reduced to its essential elements. He began to move. The composite wall between alcoves 3 and 6 was 40 centimeters of processed mineral aggregate that his sensors read through with adequate resolution, enough to give him the thermal signatures of 2 bodies, Veskalan seated toward the alcove's interior, and the very still Skriath that Zorae had flagged, positioned near the alcove entrance in a way that confirmed the guard reading beyond any reasonable doubt. The guard was oriented toward the entrance, which was the correct orientation for someone whose job was to prevent threats from coming in, and which was consequently the wrong orientation for detecting a threat that was going to come through the wall. He gave the composite material a precise 30-second assessment, density, composition, the way it would respond to a focused disruption field. And then he pressed his hand flat against it and let the field generator in his palm do the work quietly, molecular cohesion in a targeted area, dissolving with a sound that was absorbed almost entirely by the ceremonial murmur still drifting from the main hall. The opening was just large enough, and he moved through it in a single fluid motion that put him inside Alcove 6 with Veskalan's back to him, and the guard still facing the wrong direction. He took the guard first, because that was simply the correct order of operations. A precise neural disruption delivered to the back of the neck that dropped the Skriath into unconsciousness with the quiet efficiency of a system that had been designed for exactly this purpose, and had been refined through considerable field application. The guard went down without a sound, and Owlantoo caught the body and lowered it to the floor in the same movement, and by the time Veskalan had registered the faint displacement of air and begun to turn, Owlantoo was already between him and the entrance. Veskalan looked at him with the particular expression of someone who had spent decades in the business of knowing when a situation had become irrecoverable, and was now experiencing that knowledge in a direct and personal way. He was smaller than the intelligence package photographs had suggested, or perhaps it was the alcove's dimensions that made him seem so, and his low-light eyes caught the bioluminescent pulse from the walls and reflected it back with the tapetal quality Zorae had described, a faint, flat shine that gave his gaze an unsettling depth. He said something in the Skriath's primary vocal language, which Owlantoo's translation matrix rendered as a compound expression, combining a request for clarification with an acknowledgement that clarification was probably not forthcoming. "Nothing personal," Owlantoo said, which the Matrix translated back into something approximating the Skriath's language, and which was both true and the kind of thing that was entirely useless to say, but that he said anyway, because in his experience the last thing most people heard deserved to be something other than silence. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds and would, in retrospect, reorder the remaining events of Owlantoo's immediate future in ways that a complete reading of the mission briefing might have allowed him to anticipate. He moved to complete the operation with the clean precision that 140 years of Zorae's company and a considerable professional history had between them produced, and Vescalan, who was cornered and dying and aware of both facts, did the thing that 60,000 years of evolutionary history had equipped his species to do when cornered and dying. He was fast, genuinely, surprisingly fast, faster than the intelligence package's physical assessment had suggested, and he was not trying to escape or fight in any conventional sense. He was simply trying to reach Owlantoo with his mouth, with the focused desperation of an organism executing its deepest biological instruction. He almost didn't manage it. Almost was the operative word. The bite was small, a grazing contact on the outer edge of Owlantoo's left forearm where his sleeve had ridden up during the operation, lasting perhaps a second before the situation resolved in the way it had always been going to resolve, with Vescalan still, and the alcove quiet and the ceremonial murmur from the main hall continuing entirely undisturbed, indifferent to what had just occurred 6 meters away from it. Owlantoo looked at his forearm. The contact site was barely visible, a faint mark that his skin's natural repair mechanisms would have dealt with in an hour under normal circumstances, the kind of incidental damage that barely registered on any meaningful scale. He pulled his sleeve down and confirmed the guard was still unconscious and would remain so for another 4 hours, and that Vescalan was beyond any further concern, and he moved back through the composite wall the way he had come, crossed Alcove 3, and let himself out of the ceremonial structure through the same entry point he had used, slipping back into Bardland's amber half-light and the thin cold air that smelled of minerals and a world that had never quite warmed up enough to be comfortable. He was halfway back to the pod before he thought about the bite again. He pushed the thought to one side and kept walking, because the analysis of variables in the field was a discipline that required prioritization, and the immediate priority was extraction, and a barely visible mark on his forearm from a dying target was not, by any reasonable assessment, the most pressing item on the list. "Operation complete," he said into the earpiece. "Confirmed," Zorae said, and then, after a pause that was precisely 2 seconds longer than her standard acknowledgement pause, "How did it go?" It was not quite a question, which meant she had already been reading something in his sensor feed or his biometrics that she was choosing to approach indirectly, which was a conversational technique she had developed over the course of their time together, and which he recognized as reliably as he recognized anything. "Cleanly," he said. "There was a guard, as you suggested there might be. The guard is unconscious and will remain so. The target is no longer a concern. And you. I am walking back to the pod at a pace consistent with someone who has completed their work and is ready to leave a planet that has nothing aesthetically or intellectually to recommend it." "Your heart rate is elevated," Zorae said. "I just completed a field operation." "Your heart rate is elevated in a pattern that is not consistent with post-operation adrenaline normalization, which I have 17 years of comparative biometric data to characterize with some confidence." Another pause, and this one had a different quality to it entirely, not architectural, not pointed, but careful in the way that someone is careful when they are choosing the exact right moment to say something they have been holding. "Owlantoo, did the target make contact?" He looked at his forearm, at the barely visible mark beneath his sleeve, and weighed the particular cost of the pause he was about to take against the knowledge that she would read the pause as clearly as she read everything else. "There was incidental contact during the terminal phase," he said. "A grazing bite on the left forearm. Superficial." The silence that followed was not architectural, and it was not careful, and it was not pointed. It was the silence of someone absorbing information and making very rapid calculations, and not yet ready to say what those calculations were producing. How superficial, she said finally. Barely broke the surface. Lasted approximately 1 second. The target was not in a state of full viral expression at the point of contact. I think it was reflexive, a last response rather than a deliberate attempt. That distinction, Zorae said, with a precision that he recognized as the precision of someone keeping their voice very steady on purpose, may not be as meaningful as you are hoping it is. He reached the pod and palmed the hatch release and stepped inside and sat down in the pilot's seat and looked at the telemetry readouts for slightly longer than the telemetry readouts required looking at. Run the scans when I dock, he said. I am already preparing them, Zorae said, and said nothing else for the entire ascent, which told him considerably more than anything she could have put into words. The docking sequence took 4 minutes, and Zorae did not say a single word during any of them, which was, in the full context of their history together, a more expressive communication than most people managed with complete sentences. Owlantoo ran through the docking procedures with the methodical attention he gave all mechanical processes, and tried not to think about the way the scan array had already initialized itself before he had even requested it, its sensor fields reaching through the ship's internal systems toward him with a quiet thoroughness that suggested Zorae had been preparing it since approximately the moment he had told her about the bite. He settled the ship into its own systems, confirmed orbital stability, and sat in the pilot's seat for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. You can come through to the medical bay, Zorae said, or I can run the preliminary scans from here, but the resolution on the full panel is considerably better in the bay, and I would prefer the full panel. You would prefer the full panel, he repeated. I would prefer to know exactly what I'm dealing with rather than working from incomplete data, yes. I find incomplete data uncomfortable under normal circumstances, and significantly more uncomfortable under circumstances like these, which are not normal circumstances regardless of how you are currently choosing to frame them in that particular part of your mind where you put things you're not ready to examine. A brief pause. Medical bay, please. He went to the medical bay. It was a compact space by the standards of what it needed to accomplish, fitted with the kind of equipment that reflected both the age of the ship and the considerable resources that had been applied to upgrading it over the decades. A diagnostic platform that could read biological data at the cellular level. A treatment array that had been reconfigured and expanded so many times that its original manufacturer would have had difficulty recognizing it. And a pharmaceutical synthesis unit that Zorae had spent what she described as a perfectly reasonable amount of their operational budget on, and what he had described at the time as an extravagance that assumed a frequency of medical emergencies he found pessimistic. He was thinking about that conversation now with a specific quality of retrospective appreciation that he chose not to examine too closely. He sat on the diagnostic platform and let the scan array do what it had been built to do, and watched the data begin resolving on the displays around him, and waited for Zorae to tell him what the data said. She made him wait for 3 full minutes, which meant the picture was either complicated or bad or both, and when she spoke her voice had settled into the register she used when she had decided that clarity was more important than any other consideration. The virus is present, she said. It's in your bloodstream, and it has already begun the process of binding to the receptor sites that the Skriath's retroviral agent targets in Tanrigel physiology specifically, which is moving faster than I would like, though not as fast as it could be moving if the contact had been more substantial or if the target had been in a state of full active expression at the time. She paused. That is the best thing I can tell you right now, and I want you to register it as the best thing before I tell you everything else. Registered, Owlantoo said. Tell me everything else. The retroviral agent works by progressively rewriting the receptor pathway configuration in your peripheral and central metabolic systems. Not all of them, and not randomly, but with the specific elegance of something that evolved over 60,000 years to do exactly one thing very effectively. What it does at the molecular level is bind to the sites responsible for processing complex iron-carrying proteins and certain high molecular weight compounds in your blood, and it reconfigures those sites so that they become dependent on an external source of those compounds rather than your body's own production. She allowed a moment for that to settle. In plain language, It progressively dismantles your body's ability to sustain itself from its own resources and replaces that ability with a dependency on an external supply of those same compounds. From humanoid blood specifically. Because the virus evolved in a species that was most frequently threatened by humanoid or humanoid-adjacent predators, and the compounds it creates dependency for are the ones most readily available in humanoid biological systems. It is, from a purely technical standpoint, one of the more sophisticated evolved defense mechanisms the Council's xenobiologists have ever documented, which I imagine is cold comfort. Another pause. The dependency is not metaphorical, and it is not gradual in the way that some progressive conditions are gradual. It moves through stages. In the first stage, which you are currently in, the virus is establishing itself, and the receptor modifications are beginning, but your body is still largely running on its own systems. You will feel this stage primarily as fatigue and a low-grade systemic inflammation that your body will interpret as the early symptoms of a standard infection and attempt to fight accordingly. How long does the first stage last? At the rate the virus is currently progressing, based on the scan data I have right now, between 36 and 48 hours. She said it cleanly, without softening it, because she had learned over a very long time that softening factual information for him produced resentment rather than comfort and served neither of them. In the second stage, the receptor modifications reach a threshold where your body begins to actively register the absence of the compounds it has been reconfigured to need, and this is where the clinical picture becomes significantly more serious. Your metabolic systems will begin competing for the dwindling internal supply of those compounds. Your organ function will start showing measurable degradation, and you will begin experiencing what I can only describe as a profound and escalating biological imperative that your nervous system will interpret as hunger, but which is more accurately characterized as a systemic deficiency signal that will become all-consuming if it is not addressed. How long from second stage to critical failure? From the onset of second stage, without intervention, somewhere between 5 and 8 days before organ failure reaches an irreversible threshold. She paused. I want to be precise about that range because the variance matters. 5 days is the fast end of the documented cases in the Council's medical database, which I accessed during your descent and have been reading for the past 3 hours. 8 days is the slow end. Your specific Tanrigel physiology puts you closer to the middle of that range than either extreme, which means you should not comfort yourself with the slow end, and I will not catastrophize with the fast end. Owlantoo looked at the data on the displays around him, at the viral load curves and the receptor binding progression charts, and the metabolic function baselines that were still reading normal, but carried in their normalcy the faint implication of a clock that had already started. The cure, he said. Walk me through it. The cure is well established and straightforward, and is available on Tanrigel at any medical facility with a standard Council-certified biological treatment suite, which is most of them. She said this with the specific quality of someone identifying the horizon of good news before delivering the news on the other side of it. It is a targeted retroviral counteragent that disassembles the receptor modifications and restores normal pathway configuration. Full treatment takes approximately 72 hours and is highly effective when administered before irreversible organ damage has occurred. The success rate in the Council database for cases treated within the viable window is 91%. And the transit time to Tanrigel from our current position. The pause before she answered this one was not architectural, and it was not careful. It was the pause of someone who had already done this calculation many times and did not enjoy delivering the result. From Bardland's system, at this ship's maximum sustainable transit speed, 26 days, she said it flatly. 26 days to reach Tanrigel. Against a viable treatment window of 5 to 8 days from second stage onset, which begins in 36 to 48 hours. Another pause. The mathematics are not in your favor, and I want you to understand that I am not going to pretend otherwise, because pretending otherwise would be an insult to both of us and would waste time that we do not have. So I can't make it home in time, Owlantoo said, and his voice had the quality it got when he was processing something by saying it aloud rather than expressing a reaction to it. A distinction Zorae had learned to recognize because it told her when to speak and when to let the processing happen. She let it happen for approximately 10 seconds. "You cannot make it home in time without intervention," she said then. That is the accurate version of the statement. The intervention required is a regular supply of compatible humanoid blood, introduced directly into your system in the manner of a transfusion rather than consumed, because the virus creates a systemic dependency that has to be addressed at the bloodstream level. The compounds need to be delivered directly to the receptor sites, not processed through your digestive system. Which is why this is a medical condition rather than a dietary one, and why the mythology that some species have developed around it is almost entirely unhelpful. She paused again, and this pause had a different texture to it. The texture of someone who has arrived at the part of the information they have been building toward and is now deciding exactly how to deliver it. With a regular supply of compatible humanoid blood, roughly 1 to 2 units per day depending on your viral load progression, you can maintain your metabolic function at a level that keeps organ damage from occurring and allows you to complete the transit to Tanrigel within the viable treatment window. 1 to 2 units per day for 26 days, he said. That's a significant volume. It is between 26 and 52 units of blood, yes, accounting for daily variance and building in a safety margin for the possibility that your viral load progresses faster than the current projection suggests it will. She said this with the composure of someone who had already made peace with the number and was now helping him make peace with it. I have identified the nearest star system with a humanoid population whose biological profile is compatible with your needs. The system is approximately 3 days transit from our current position, which is well within your first stage window, meaning you would arrive before the dependency becomes acute. He already knew which system she meant, because there was only one system within 3 days that fit the description, and he had been aware of it in the abstract geography of this region of space for as long as he had been operating in it, the way you were aware of a city you had never visited because it appeared on every map. "Earth," he said. "Earth," Zorae confirmed. "Third planet of a single star system, the star designated Sol by its inhabitants, located approximately 6 light-years from Barnard's star in the direction of the galactic core. The inhabitants are a humanoid species called humans, biologically compatible with your requirements to a degree that the Council's xenobiological database confirms as entirely adequate for your purposes, and sufficiently developed in their medical infrastructure to have established organized blood storage systems in their healthcare facilities." She paused. "They are not members of the Galactic Council. They are not aware of the Galactic Council. They are, by Council classification, a pre-contact civilization at a developmental stage that falls under the non-interference protocols, which means that your presence there needs to be as minimal and undetectable as possible, and that any exposure of advanced technology is to be avoided to the extent that circumstances allow." "To the extent that circumstances allow," he repeated. "That's a flexible standard. It is the standard that exists, and I am telling you about it before you arrive rather than after, which I consider an improvement over certain other briefings in recent memory." There was something in the delivery of that line that was not quite humor and not quite reproach, and occupied a precise point between them that only someone who had known her for a very long time would have been able to locate. The humans have blood storage facilities in their medical centers. They store blood in organized inventories by type and compatibility classification, which means concentrated supply in fixed locations, which from a purely logistical standpoint is the most efficient possible arrangement for your purposes. "You want me to rob a hospital? I want you to survive," Zorae said, and the shift in her voice was small enough that most people would have missed it entirely. A fractional movement from the register of information delivery into something that had more mass to it. Something that had been present underneath the clinical precision of everything she had said for the past 20 minutes and was now, briefly, audible. "The hospital is the mechanism. The surviving is the point. And I want to be clear with you, because clarity is what I do, and because we have known each other long enough that I think I have earned the right to say this without you deflecting it into a joke. The viral load I am reading in your system right now will kill you if it is not addressed. And I have sat through a very large number of scenarios over the course of our time together where you have been in danger. And I have managed those scenarios by focusing on the operational problem rather than what the operational problem meant. And I am doing that now. I am absolutely doing that now. But I need you to understand that I am doing it, and that underneath the doing of it is the simple fact that you need to not die. The medical bay was quiet around him, the diagnostic platform humming its low, continuous hum, the data displays showing him his own biology in the precise and dispassionate language of numbers. "You're worried," he said. "I am running optimal contingency calculations," she said. "Zorae." A pause. "Yes," she said. "I am worried. I'm quite considerably worried, and I would appreciate it if you would take that information seriously rather than filing it under the category of things I say that you acknowledge and then set aside." Another pause, shorter. "You are the only person who has ever been allowed to call me by name rather than by designation, and I did not give you that permission so that you could use it to confirm that I am experiencing an emotional state that you were already perfectly aware of and were going to set aside anyway." "I'm not setting it aside," he said. "You're thinking about how to respond to it in a way that addresses it without committing to any behavioral change, which is functionally the same thing. That's an uncharitable reading. It is an accurate reading developed over approximately 140 years of observational data, which is a sample size I feel confident in." She paused, and when she spoke again the precision was back, the clinical register reasserted, but it carried something underneath it now that it had not carried before the last few minutes, something that had been named and therefore could not be unnamed. 3 days to Earth. I'll plot the course. You need rest, and your first supplemental treatment from the ship's emergency biological supplies will need to happen in approximately 6 hours, which will slow the initial progression and give us more margin on the timeline. The ship's supply is not sufficient for the full transit home, which is why Earth is not optional, but it buys time, and I have already cross-referenced it against your current viral load to confirm compatibility. "You prepared the treatment before I docked," he said. "I prepared it when you told me about the bite," she said. "While you were walking back to the pod. While you were telling me it was superficial." He looked at the displays for a moment. "How long have you known that superficial wasn't the right word for it?" "Since I read the section of the brief marked biological hazards," Zorae said. "Which I read before we entered transit. Which was the same brief that you read 1/3 of and called the general idea." She let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. "I have been waiting to say that, and I want you to know that it brings me absolutely no satisfaction whatsoever." "That's not true," he said. "No," she agreed, and there was something in it that was not quite a smile because she did not have a face, but that occupied the space where a smile would have been. "It's not entirely true. But the satisfaction is very small, and the worry is very large. And I would like you to go and rest so that I can plot a course to a planet I have spent 140 years hoping you would never need to visit." Owlantoo looked at his forearm one more time, at the barely visible mark beneath his sleeve that had started all of this, and then he stood up from the diagnostic platform and walked toward the crew quarters, and behind him the medical bay hummed and the data displays continued their quiet work, and Zorae began plotting the course to Earth without saying anything else, because she had said what needed to be said, and now there was only the math, and she had always been very good at the math. It was everything else she found difficult. The course to Earth was, from a purely navigational standpoint, straightforward in the way that most things were straightforward when you had the right equipment and the right mind running it. And Zorae had both in abundance, which meant that by the time Owlantoo had slept for 6 hours and returned to the ship's main cabin with a particular quality of alertness that came from sleep taken under medical necessity rather than genuine rest. She had already completed the calculations and was waiting to walk him through them with the thoroughness she applied to anything she considered important enough to not leave to his independent interpretation. "Sit down," she said, which was how she began conversations she had prepared for. "I'm already sitting down." "Then stay sitting down, because this is going to take a moment, and I don't want you moving around the cabin processing it kinetically the way you do when you're uncomfortable with information." She paused. "The course is set, and the ship is already in transit. So the decisions have been made, and what I'm giving you now is the science behind them rather than an invitation to second-guess the routing, which I want to establish clearly up front, because last time I gave you navigation science, you treated it as a negotiating position. Last time the routing added 4 days. Last time the routing avoided a debris field that would have required 3 hull repairs and a conversation with a council checkpoint that neither of us wanted to have, and the 4 days were a reasonable price for both of those outcomes, and we have had this conversation already and I don't want to have it again. A brief pause. The distance from Barnard's star to Sol is approximately 6.1 light-years, measured in the units the humans use, which are convenient, and which I'm going to use for this explanation because the alternative is converting everything into Tanrigel stellar measurements, and this is not the moment for that kind of cognitive overhead. 6.1 light-years, he said. At what speed? That is precisely the question, and it is the question that requires the science. So I'm glad you asked it rather than waiting for me to arrive at it organically. She settled into the particular register she used for technical explanation, which was not different in its precision from her other registers, but carried a different quality of engagement. Something that had always told him she genuinely enjoyed this part regardless of the circumstances prompting it. The fundamental problem with traveling between star systems is not, as many people who have not thought carefully about it tend to assume, purely one of speed. It is a problem of physics that sits at the intersection of special relativity, energy requirements, and the biological limitations of the beings doing the traveling. And all 3 of those factors are relevant to our current situation in ways that I want you to understand rather than simply accept. Understood. Explain. Under the physics that governs this universe, no object with mass can be accelerated to the speed of light, because the energy required to do so increases asymptotically as you approach that limit, meaning that the closer you get to light speed, the more energy you need, and the more energy you need, the more mass your fuel adds to the system, and the more mass in the system, the more energy you need to accelerate it, and this particular spiral does not resolve in your favor at any point along its length. She paused to let that sit. The practical consequence is that this ship, like all ships operating under the Council's standard transit technology, does not travel at the speed of light. It travels at a significant fraction of the speed of light during its acceleration and cruise phases, and it augments that with a spatial compression drive that does not technically move the ship faster than light, but instead reduces the effective distance the ship needs to cover by manipulating the geometry of the space through which it is traveling. The transit drive. The transit drive, yes, which is what allowed us to reach Bardland from Tanrigel in a time that would otherwise have been physically impossible, and which is what we are using now. She paused. The spatial compression technology works by generating a controlled distortion field around the ship that compresses the space ahead of it and expands the space behind it, effectively moving the bubble of space. The ship occupies through the surrounding space at a rate that is not constrained by the relativistic limits on the ship itself. The ship inside its bubble is not technically moving faster than light. The bubble, relative to the surrounding space, is effectively doing something that produces the same result without violating the underlying physics in ways that would cause the universe to object. The universe has opinions about what it will tolerate, Owlantoo said. The universe has consistent mathematical rules that function as opinions in the sense that violating them produces consequences, yes. There was something in her delivery that acknowledged the remark without rewarding it excessively. The drive is not without its own constraints. It requires significant energy to initialize and maintain. It cannot be engaged in close proximity to large gravitational sources without creating instabilities that are unpleasant at best and catastrophic at worst. And it does not compress space infinitely. There are practical limits to the compression ratio that the field generators on this ship can sustain, which translate directly into an effective maximum transit speed. Which is, for this ship, under optimal conditions with full power allocated to the drive, the effective transit speed is approximately 40 times the speed of light, which sounds impressive until you do the arithmetic on 6.1 light-years, and discover that 40 times light speed still requires a transit time of approximately 55 days to cover that distance under drive power alone. She paused in the way she paused when she anticipated an objection. Before you say anything, no, we are not traveling for 55 days because the drive does not operate at maximum compression for the entire journey. Transit involves an acceleration phase during which the compression ratio builds, a cruise phase at maximum sustainable compression, and a deceleration phase during which the compression ratio reduces as the ship approaches its destination. And the acceleration and deceleration phases are considerably less efficient than the cruise phase. So how long? From Barnard's star to Sol, accounting for the full transit profile of this ship with power allocation optimized for speed rather than efficiency, which I have already done, because efficiency is not our priority right now. The total transit time is approximately 71 hours. She paused. Just under 3 days to use the human unit, which is the most relevant unit for your current timeline. Owlantoo sat with that number for a moment, running it against the staging Zorae had given him in the medical bay, 36 to 48 hours to second stage onset, 5 to 8 days from second stage to critical failure, and finding in the arithmetic a margin that existed but did not inspire comfort. 71 hours puts me arriving at Earth while I'm still in first stage, he said. Arriving at Earth in first stage, yes, assuming the viral progression continues at its current rate and does not accelerate, which is the median expectation and not a guarantee. She paused. The supplemental treatment I administered before you slept has slowed the receptor binding progression by approximately 18% relative to the baseline curve, which is meaningful but not transformative. You will feel functional for the majority of the transit. By the time we reach Earth's system, you will be beginning to feel the early effects of the transition into second stage. Fatigue beyond what the supplemental treatment can fully address, some metabolic irregularity, and an early version of the deficiency signal that will still be manageable at that point, but will make itself known. Manageable how? Manageable in the sense that it will be present and uncomfortable rather than overwhelming and debilitating, which is the distinction between second stage early onset and second stage progression, and which is the distinction I am trying to preserve by getting you to Earth inside 71 hours rather than taking a more conservative route. She paused again. I want to discuss the return journey, because the mathematics of that are what determine how much blood you need to acquire on Earth, and I want you to have the full picture before you arrive so that you are not making inventory decisions under pressure. Walk me through it. The return journey from Earth to Tanrigel is approximately 5.9 light years, which at this ship's transit profile is approximately 68 hours under the same optimized power allocation I am using for the outbound leg, slightly shorter than the inbound leg because Sol is marginally closer to Tanrigel than Bardland is. She paused. 68 hours of transit, plus whatever time you spend on Earth acquiring supplies, gives us a total elapsed time from now to Tanrigel arrival of approximately 140 hours in the best case, assuming Earth operations take no more than 12 hours, which is an optimistic assumption, but one I am using as the planning baseline. She paused again. Against that timeline, your daily requirement for supplemental blood once second stage is fully established is between 1 and 2 units per day, with the variance depending on viral load progression, physical exertion, and how your specific physiology responds to the treatment over time. At 1 unit per day, you need approximately 6 units for the return journey. At 2 units per day, you need 12. I am planning for the high end with a safety margin of 25%, which means the minimum viable supply is 15 units. 15 units to be safe, he said. 15 units as the floor, yes, below which I am not comfortable with the margins, and above which every additional unit increases your survival probability in a way that is not linear but that matters. She paused. A hospital blood bank in a mid-sized human medical facility will typically hold between 200 and 400 units in total inventory across all blood types, of which a meaningful fraction will be compatible with your requirements, because the virus is not particularly selective about human blood type. The compounds it has created dependency for are present in sufficient concentration across all human blood types, though certain types have marginally higher concentrations than others. Which types? O positive and O negative have the highest concentration of the relevant compounds and are therefore marginally preferable, but A positive and B positive are entirely adequate, and you should not pass over compatible units in pursuit of an optimal type when adequate units are available. She paused. I am telling you this because I know how you approach optimization problems, and I do not want you spending time you do not have on marginal gains. That's a fair characterization of a tendency I have, he said. It is one of several fair characterizations of tendencies you have that I have developed over a considerable period of observation. There was something in the delivery that was dry without being unkind, which was the register that represented, in his experience, her most genuine mode of communication with him. The humans have been storing blood since approximately the mid-20th century by their own calendar, and their storage technology, while primitive by council standards, is functional. Refrigerated units maintaining temperature between 2 and 6 degrees Celsius for whole blood and packed cells, with a shelf life of between 35 and 42 days for refrigerated whole blood, which is important because you need the blood to remain viable for the duration of your return transit. So I can't take blood that's already been in storage for more than a week or so, he said. You can take blood that has been in storage for up to 2 weeks with reasonable confidence in its viability for your purposes, but fresher is better, and I would prioritize accordingly if the inventory allows for selectivity. She paused. Your storage conditions on the ship are considerably better than the humans' refrigeration units. So once you have the blood aboard and in our medical bay storage system, degradation will not be a concern for the duration of the transit. Owlantoo looked out at the transit field that wrapped the ship, the spatial compression creating that particular visual quality of travel under drive power. A subtle distortion at the edges of the forward view. The stars ahead shifted fractionally blue, and the stars behind shifted fractionally red by the Doppler effect operating on light in ways that were physically real, even if the perceptual difference was small enough to require knowing what you were looking at to notice it. Tell me about Earth, he said. The pause that followed was brief, and had the specific quality of a pause produced by mild surprise, the kind Zorae produced when he said something she had not been expecting. Tell you about Earth, she repeated. You've had the database on it since before we left Tanrigel. You always read everything, including the things I don't ask about, and Earth has been in the Council's observation catalog for long enough that there's a substantial file on it. He watched the distorted starfield. Tell me about it. That is a request I was not anticipating, she said, and I want to note it as such before I comply with it, because it is the kind of request that suggests a quality of curiosity about the universe that I have been arguing you possess, and you have been arguing you don't for the better part of a century, and I find the timing interesting. I'm trying to understand the operational environment. You are trying to understand the operational environment by asking me to tell you about a planet rather than requesting its tactical and logistical profile, which you have already reviewed and which would be the standard operational framing. She paused. But I will tell you about it, because it is genuinely interesting, and because I have wanted to tell you about it for some time, and I am going to take the opening while it exists. She told him about Earth. She told him about a planet with an axial tilt of 23.5 degrees that gave it seasons, genuinely pronounced seasons that reorganized the entire surface biosphere on a cyclical basis in a way that had driven evolutionary complexity at a rate that the Council's xenobiologists considered remarkable. And she told him about an atmosphere that was 21% oxygen, which was on the high end of the range for inhabited worlds, and which had produced, among other things, a biosphere of extraordinary metabolic intensity, organisms burning energy at rates that most inhabited worlds' life forms would find physiologically unsustainable. She told him about a planet that was 71% covered in liquid water, which was unusual, and about the fact that this water was in constant global circulation through an evaporation and precipitation cycle that functioned as a planetary temperature regulation system of considerable sophistication. She told him about a species that had developed from a primate lineage approximately 300,000 years ago by their own geological record, had developed written language roughly 5,000 years ago, had achieved spaceflight capability roughly 60 years ago, and had managed in that same 60 years to simultaneously advance their computational technology to a level that the Council's observers had classified as accelerating and develop enough nuclear weapons to render their own planet uninhabitable several times over, which she described as a combination of capabilities that the Council's Contact Assessment Division found both promising and deeply concerning in roughly equal measure. They have nuclear weapons, Owlantoo said. They have a great many nuclear weapons, yes, and they are aware of the consequences of using them, and have thus far refrained from doing so on a civilizational scale, which the Contact Assessment Division considers a meaningful indicator of long-term viability, even if the margin has been closer than anyone would prefer on several documented occasions. She paused. They also have art, music, literature, mathematics, medicine, and a philosophical tradition spanning several thousand years that has produced a genuinely diverse range of frameworks for thinking about existence, ethics, and the nature of consciousness, which I mention because a species is more than its weapons inventory, and I find the reductive framing frustrating. You've formed opinions about them. I've had the database for 3 years, and I find the species interesting, yes. The fact that I find things interesting is not news. Another pause. They have also, as I mentioned in the medical bay, developed mythology around blood dependency that is partially relevant to your situation and largely useless. The vampire myth, which exists in various forms across multiple human cultures, involves a being that requires human blood to survive, is typically immortal or very long-lived, has enhanced physical abilities, and operates at night to avoid detection. The mythology attributes supernatural rather than biological origins to the condition, involves consumption rather than transfusion, and has accumulated enough cultural elaboration over several centuries that it bears only a passing resemblance to your actual situation. But the resemblance is there, and I want you to be aware of it. You're telling me that if a human sees me doing what I'm going to be doing on their planet, they have a pre-existing mythological framework they might drop me into, he said. I'm telling you that the pre-existing mythological framework exists and that it has produced, in the human's popular culture, a very large number of stories, films, and other narrative artifacts that will be running in the background of any human mind that encounters you under the wrong circumstances, and that the framework they will reach for is not going to be accurate and is also not going to be favorable. She paused. I'm also telling you that the mythology has some useful structural overlap with your operational requirements. Vampire stories almost universally involve the subject operating at night, avoiding populated areas, and moving quickly. So if any human does construct that framework around you, their behavioral response will be to not look for you in daylight and to not investigate too thoroughly. Because the mythology also involves outcomes for investigators that human storytelling has consistently characterized as negative. Fear is operationally useful, he said. Fear is operationally useful right up until it produces a response that is the opposite of the withdrawal you want, yes. And I will note that a significant subset of human vampire mythology also involves humans organizing specifically to hunt and destroy the subject of the fear, so I would not rely on it as a primary operational tool. She paused. The operational tool I would rely on is the disguise field, moving at night, and taking what you need quickly without creating a situation that draws the kind of attention that persists beyond your departure. You're telling me to be professional. I'm telling you to be professional on a planet where you are sick, operating under time pressure, and about to steal from a medical facility while armed with technology that could level a city block, yes. Another pause. I have confidence in your professionalism. I have somewhat less confidence in the intersection of your professionalism and your current viral load, which is why I am being more thorough than you might consider strictly necessary. You're always more thorough than I consider strictly necessary. And yet here you are, still alive after 140 years, which I consider a data point worth acknowledging. The ship hummed around them, the transit drive maintaining its steady spatial compression, the stars ahead blue-shifted by the mathematics of relative motion. Sleep again if you can. I'll monitor the viral progression and wake you if anything changes significantly. We reach Earth system in approximately 63 hours from now, and you will want to be as rested as the circumstances allow when we arrive, because the operation on Earth is going to require the full version of you and not whatever approximation the virus will be producing by that point. The full version of me, he said. The version that reads complete mission briefings and takes biological hazard warnings seriously, she said. Yes. That version. I would very much like to have that version available. That version and I have a complicated relationship. You and your own better judgment have always had a complicated relationship, Zorae said, with the weight of someone who had watched that relationship play out across a very long time and had formed detailed and well-evidenced views about it. It is one of the things about you that I find most consistently frustrating and most consistently characteristic, and I have learned to hold both of those assessments simultaneously without resolving them into a single conclusion, because that is apparently what knowing you requires. He leaned back in the seat and looked at the distorted stars and thought about a planet he had never visited that was 63 hours away and knew nothing about him, and had blood in refrigerated storage in facilities that would not know what was coming until it had already been and gone. Zorae, he said. Still here, she said, which was the answer she always gave when he said her name without following it with anything, because she had learned that it was the answer the moment required. 63 hours, he said. 63 hours, she confirmed, and dimmed the cabin lights without being asked, because she had been doing this long enough to know when the conversation was over and the thinking had begun, and she had always understood the difference between the two. Sol announced itself as a yellow-white point of light that grew into a star over the course of the deceleration phase with the unhurried confidence of something that had been burning for 4.5 billion years and had no particular opinion about whether anyone was watching. Owlantoo watched anyway. The transit field collapsed on schedule as the ship dropped below the compression threshold required for safe drive operation in proximity to a stellar mass, and the transition from drive space back to normal vacuum had the usual quality of a held breath released, a subtle shift in every system aboard, as though the ship itself was settling back into physics it found more comfortable. Sol system entry confirmed, Zorae said. We are approximately 40 astronomical units from the primary, which puts us well outside the heliopause of the inner system. No artificial signals detected at this range that would indicate awareness of our presence. The humans' most distant active spacecraft are considerably closer to their home planet than we are, and none of them have sensor capability that would resolve us at this distance. How long to Earth from here? At sublight cruise, approximately 9 hours. I'm taking us in on a trajectory that keeps us in the outer system shadow until we're close enough for a direct high-inclination approach to the night side, which minimizes our exposure to the humans' ground and orbital observation infrastructure. She paused. They have satellites. A considerable number of satellites, actually. Communications, navigation, weather observation, and a military reconnaissance network that is more sophisticated than their general technological level might suggest. None of it will detect us with our cloak engaged, but I prefer not to thread through it unnecessarily. Show me the planet. The forward display shifted from navigational data to the optical feed, enhanced and magnified, and Earth resolved out of the distance as a small disk of blue and white that grew incrementally over the minutes that followed into something with genuine presence. Cloud systems spiraling across ocean surfaces, continental masses in shades of brown and green, and the particular ochre of desert. The Terminator line between day and night, a clean curve that divided the planet into two entirely different worlds, depending on which side you were looking at. Owlantoo looked at it for a long time without saying anything. You're making a face again, Zorae said. I'm assessing the operational environment. You're looking at it the way you looked at the bioluminescent walls in the Skriath ceremonial structure, which is to say with an attention that has nothing to do with operations. She paused. It's a beautiful planet. You're allowed to notice that. I notice it has a lot of ocean, he said, which is operationally relevant because it constrains the viable landing zones. It does have a lot of ocean, yes. 71%, as I mentioned during transit. Another pause shorter. The city I've identified as the landing target is on the eastern seaboard of the largest northern continental mass, mid-sized by human standards, with a hospital complex large enough to have a substantial blood bank and a surrounding urban density that provides enough ambient electromagnetic noise to mask our systems even without the cloak. She overlaid the city on the display. Population of approximately 400,000. Hospital complex in the northern district. Blood bank on the second sublevel. Based on the electromagnetic signatures consistent with the refrigeration systems their storage protocols require. You've already mapped the hospital. I've been mapping the hospital since we entered the system. I find it useful to have the work done before you ask for it rather than after. A brief pause. Your disguise field is calibrated. Your shields are at operational standard. You have the collection containers from the medical bay, which will maintain blood viability for the transit home without any degradation issues. I have also prepared a translation matrix for English, which is the dominant language of the region you're landing in. So if you hear anything while you're inside the facility, you will understand it. You think I'll need to understand what they're saying? I think information is always preferable to its absence, and that a guard shouting something at you is more useful parsed as language than experienced as noise. She paused. Owlantoo, how are you feeling? He considered giving her the deflecting answer and decided against it, partly because she would read through it, and partly because the honest answer was more interesting to say. The deficiency signal started about 4 hours ago, he said. It's low grade. Background noise rather than anything insistent. But it's there. That's consistent with early second stage onset, which is approximately 6 hours ahead of the median projection. She said it without alarm, which he recognized as a deliberate choice rather than an absence of concern. It means we have less margin than I was planning for, not zero margin. You get in, you get what you need, you get back to the ship. No extended operations, no unnecessary complications, no spending time on optimization when adequate will do. You've said adequate will do before. I find it philosophically unsatisfying. You find most things philosophically unsatisfying when they're not done to your precise specifications, Zorae said. And under normal circumstances, I find that quality of yours professionally admirable and personally exhausting in roughly equal measure. Under these circumstances, I find it a liability, and I am asking you to set it aside for one operation. Noted, he said, which was not the same as agreement, and they both knew it. The ship descended through the outer system on the trajectory Zorae had plotted, the cloak engaged and running clean, crossing the orbital paths of the outer planets with the indifferent ease of technology that had no interest in being noticed. Jupiter resolved briefly in the display as they passed its orbital radius, a vast banded sphere that dominated the middle distance with the casual authority of a planet containing more mass than everything else in the system combined, except the star itself. That's a large planet, Owlantoo said. It is the largest planet in this system, yes. The humans are aware of it and have sent several spacecraft to study it, which speaks reasonably well of their scientific curiosity, given that they only achieved basic spaceflight capability in the last 60 of their years. She paused. They have a moon there, one of Jupiter's moons, called Europa. That has a liquid water ocean under an ice shell, and there is a meaningful scientific debate among them about whether that ocean contains life. They don't know yet. Do we know? A pause with a slightly different quality to it. That information is in a council database I do not have full access to from this ship, she said carefully. And I think the answer to your question is probably yes. And I think the humans are going to find that out for themselves in the not very distant future. And I think it is going to be one of the more significant moments in their history. And they have no idea, he said. They have a suspicion and a great deal of hope, Zorae said, which is a combination that their species seems to run on to a remarkable degree. The inner system opened up ahead of them as they continued the descent. The asteroid belt a sparse scattering of rocky bodies that the navigational system threaded through without particular effort. Mars a small reddish disk that Owlantoo looked at briefly, and which reminded him, in its color and its dryness and its thin cold atmosphere, of Bardland in ways he did not find comforting. Then Earth was in the forward display at a scale that made it real rather than abstract, filling the view with its blue and white, and the scattered lights of its night side visible as they came around into the shadow. A fine, irregular lacework of illumination that mapped the presence of a civilization that had no idea it was being visited. Coming up on the landing approach, Zorae said. I'm taking us down through the upper atmosphere on a steep, high-inclination vector that minimizes our atmospheric transit time. and keeps us above the cloud layer until the last possible moment. Hull temperature will be within normal parameters. The cloak handles the optical and radar signature. We will be, to any human observer or instrument, nothing. And if someone looks up at the right moment and sees a heat signature, then someone looks up at the right moment and sees a heat signature that will be gone before they finish deciding what they're looking at, and which will be filed, if it is filed at all, in the category of things that people see in the sky that no one takes seriously. She paused. The humans have a long history of seeing things in the sky that no one takes seriously. We are not the first. We will not be the last. The ship hit the upper atmosphere, and the hull sang briefly with the friction of entry, the cloud layer rushing up to meet them and then swallowing them whole. And for 30 seconds they were inside a white nothing while the ship descended through it. And then the clouds broke and the city was below them, spread across the dark terrain in its irregular constellation of streetlights and building lights, and the moving threads of vehicle traffic that traced the arteries of a human settlement at 2 in the morning. Owlantoo looked at it with the particular attention he gave things he was seeing for the first time, and expected to see only once. "It's louder than I expected," he said, meaning the electromagnetic spectrum, the constant chatter of human communications and systems that his receivers were picking up even through the hull. "They talk constantly." "They do," Zorae said. "To each other, to their machines, to networks that connect their machines to each other. The volume of communication this species generates per unit time is among the highest the Council has documented for a per-contact civilization. They appear to find silence uncomfortable." A brief pause. "The hospital is 4 kilometers northeast of our current position. I'm setting down in a green space adjacent to an industrial area. Low foot traffic at this hour. No surveillance coverage in the immediate vicinity. Enough canopy cover to keep the ship visually concealed even without the cloak." The ship settled into the designated space with the quiet competence of systems that had done this kind of thing on a great many worlds, the landing struts finding the ground with a gentleness that belied their purpose, and the engine systems cycled down to standby with a subsiding hum that left the night outside very quiet by comparison. Owlantoo stood, checked his equipment with the systematic efficiency of long habit, confirmed the shield array, the cloak, the collection containers, and the disguise field that was currently rendering him, to any human eye, as something that could pass for a tall man in dark clothing at any distance greater than about 10 meters. "Disguise field is stable," Zorae said, reading his system's check in real time. "Your biometrics are elevated but within operational parameters. The deficiency signal is present, but not at a level that should affect your judgment or your coordination. I want you back at the ship in under 2 hours. 2 hours is generous for this kind of operation. 2 hours is the window within which I am comfortable, yes. If you are not back in 2 hours, I will become uncomfortable. And when I become uncomfortable, I become communicative. And when I become communicative at volume over an open channel, while you are inside a human medical facility, the operational security implications are something we would both prefer to avoid." He was already moving toward the hatch when he paused at it, turning back toward the cabin with the particular hesitation of someone who had something to say and was not entirely certain how to say it, which was unusual enough for him that Zorae registered it before he had even opened his mouth. "Zorae," he said, and the way he said it carried everything he was not going to put into a longer sentence. The acknowledgement of the margin they were working inside, the awareness of what it meant that she had plotted this course and prepared these containers and mapped this hospital while he slept. All of it compressed into her name the way it always was when words felt inadequate to the actual weight of the moment. "I know," she said, with the quiet certainty of someone who had been listening to him say her name for 140 years and had learned to hear everything underneath it. And then she said the only other word the moment needed, which was the word that sent him through the hatch and into the dark of an alien world that didn't know he was there. "Go." The city at 2 in the morning had a particular quality that Owlantoo had not anticipated, which was that it was not actually quiet in any meaningful sense of the word, but rather that it had exchanged one kind of noise for another. The daytime density of human movement and activity replaced by something more sparse and irregular, punctuated by the distant sounds of vehicles, and the occasional human voice carrying farther than it intended in the cooler air. He moved through it with the cloak engaged, following the route Zorae had mapped into his navigation system, and found that the city rewarded a certain kind of attention that had nothing to do with his operational objectives and everything to do with the simple fact that he had never been here before, and the place was genuinely unlike anywhere he had visited. The architecture was varied in a way that suggested centuries of construction without any overarching plan. Older stone buildings sitting beside glass and steel structures that caught the ambient light of the street lamps and threw it back in fragmented angles. And the trees that lined several of the wider pathways were large enough to suggest they had been there longer than most of the buildings around them. "You're moving slower than your navigation pace," Zorae said in his earpiece. "I'm moving at an operationally appropriate pace for an urban environment with irregular foot traffic," he said. "You're looking at the architecture. I'm assessing potential cover positions. The building you just slowed down to examine is a public house that has been closed for 3 hours and offers no tactical value whatsoever," she said, with the precision of someone reading his exact position and orientation from the ship 4 kilometers away. "It does have some interesting Victorian brickwork, if that's what we're calling an operational assessment." He resumed his navigation pace without commenting on this. The hospital announced itself first as a complex of illuminated signs, and then as a series of large connected buildings set back from the main road behind a paved area where several human vehicles were parked in the scattered distribution of an overnight complement rather than a full daytime population. The main entrance was lit and had visible human activity, a handful of figures moving through the lobby behind the glass frontage, and what appeared to be a single individual at a reception station. Owlantoo circled the building at a distance of 30 meters, cloaked, reading the electromagnetic signatures through the walls with a passive sensor array, and cross-referencing them against the map Zorae had built from orbital observation. "Blood bank is on the second sublevel, accessed from the interior stairwell on the building's north side," Zorae confirmed in his ear. "The refrigeration signatures are consistent with multiple storage units running at between 2 and 6 degrees. I'm reading what appears to be a staff presence on the first sublevel, but not the second, probably a single technician doing overnight inventory or maintenance on the level above the blood bank rather than in it. Security. 2 guards on the ground floor, one of whom is stationary at the main entrance desk, and one of whom is on a patrol circuit that takes approximately 18 minutes to complete, and currently has that individual on the eastern side of the building, which is away from your entry point." She paused. "I want to flag that the guards appear to be armed, which is not standard for medical facilities in this region by the Council's general assessment, and suggests either a specific security contract or a response to prior incidents at this location that the orbital survey data doesn't give me enough information to characterize." "Armed with what?" "Standard human projectile sidearms, chemically propelled metal projectiles, effective range of approximately 50 meters in trained hands, capable of delivering meaningful kinetic force, but not capable of penetrating your shield array at its current setting, which I want you to remember in the event that someone decides to use one." She paused again. "Remembering it will be considerably easier if you do not panic, which I mention only because being shot at on an alien planet at 2 in the morning, while experiencing the early onset of a viral deficiency condition, is the kind of circumstance that can produce reactions inconsistent with optimal decision-making." "I don't panic," he said. "You don't panic in the conventional sense, no," she agreed. "You do occasionally make decisions under fire that prioritize elegance over efficiency, which produces its own category of complications." He found the north side entry point, a service access door that the electromagnetic survey had identified as using a simple electronic lock of the kind that his bypass tool handled without any particular effort, the mechanism yielding in approximately 4 seconds with a soft click that was absorbed by the ambient noise of the building's ventilation system running steadily in the walls around him. The interior of the hospital at this hour had its own specific atmosphere, the smell of antiseptic compounds and recycled air, the particular fluorescent quality of lighting that was maintained for function rather than comfort, the distant sounds of the building's operational systems creating a continuous low texture of mechanical life beneath the human quiet of the overnight hours. He disengaged the cloak inside the stairwell, because moving cloaked in a confined interior space required a level of constant positional calculation that he preferred to reserve for situations that genuinely required it. And the stairwell was empty, and the disguise field was adequate for any incidental encounter he was likely to have on the way to the second sublevel. The stairs descended with the utilitarian concrete functionality of a part of the building that was not designed for anyone to spend time in, and he moved down them quickly and quietly and found the second sublevel corridor exactly where Zorae's map had placed it. A long, straight passage with overhead lighting at reduced overnight intensity, lined with the kind of institutional doors that suggested storage and technical functions rather than patient care. The blood bank was the third door on the left, identified by the persistent cool emanating from it even through the door material and the specific electromagnetic signature of multiple refrigeration units running in close proximity. The lock was more substantial than the entry door had been, a keycard system with a secondary pin pad, and it took his bypass tool closer to 40 seconds to negotiate, which he spent listening to the building around him and confirming through his passive sensors that the technician Zorae had identified remained on the level above, and the patrol guard remained on the eastern exterior. The door opened, and the cold came out to meet him, the temperature differential between the corridor and the storage room immediate and significant, carrying with it the particular clean smell of refrigerated medical equipment and the faintly metallic quality of stored blood that his system recognized now in a way it had not recognized anything before the infection. A low-frequency biological awareness that was the deficiency signal expressing itself through his senses rather than through his metabolism. He noted this with clinical detachment and filed it as data rather than experience, because the alternative was to spend time on it that he did not have. The storage units were arranged along 3 walls, tall refrigerated cabinets with transparent doors that showed the organized inventory within. Bags of blood in their various type classifications, racked in labeled rows, with a careful system of a facility that understood that its inventory represented a direct correspondence to human lives at some future point of need. He began working through the inventory with the selective efficiency Zorae had briefed him on, identifying the O-positive and O-negative units first, then the positive, checking the storage dates on each bag against the 2-week viability window, and taking only what fell within it, filling the collection containers from the medical bay with the methodical attention of someone doing exactly what they came to do and not one thing more. He had filled 8 bags and was reaching for the 9th when the door behind him opened. The guard was not the patrol guard whose circuit Zorae had been tracking, which meant the facility had a third security presence that the orbital survey had not identified, and which meant that Owlantoo was standing in a lit room holding a collection container full of blood bags with his disguise field active but his cloak disengaged, and the guard was close enough that the disguise field was operating at the very edge of its reliable range. The guard was a large human male with the particular quality of alertness that suggested either genuine professionalism or a very recent coffee, and he looked at Owlantoo with the direct attention of someone whose eyes were telling him that something was wrong without yet having resolved what specifically that something was. "Hey," the guard said, which the translation matrix rendered as a greeting that was also an interrogation, the single syllable carrying a full sentence's worth of challenge and demand in the way that human informal language apparently compressed itself routinely. "What are you doing in here?" Owlantoo straightened and turned to face him at the angle that kept the disguise field between them at maximum effectiveness, and said, in English that the translation matrix produced with adequate fluency if not perfect intonation, "Inventory check." "Overnight audit." The guard looked at the collection containers. He looked at Owlantoo's hands. He looked at the gap in the refrigerated cabinet where 10 bags had recently been. His hand moved toward the sidearm at his hip with the reflexive automation of training rather than conscious decision, and he opened his mouth to say something into the radio at his shoulder. Owlantoo engaged the cloak. The effect on the guard was immediate and visceral. The human stumbled backward against the door frame with the full-body reaction of a person whose visual system had just reported something that their understanding of physics categorically refused to accept. And in the 2 seconds that the shock bought, Owlantoo moved to the side of the room away from the door and stood completely still and waited. The guard stood in the doorway, breathing with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a fear response, his hand still on the sidearm, his eyes moving across the room with the systematic scanning of training reasserting itself over shock. And then he said something into his radio, and a second guard appeared in the corridor behind him within 40 seconds. "There's someone in here," the first guard said. The second guard looked at the room, which appeared to be empty, and looked at the collection containers on the counter, and looked at the gap in the refrigerated cabinet, and drew his own sidearm with the less hesitant manner of someone who had decided to treat the situation as a threat regardless of whether the threat was currently visible. "Medical staff," the second guard said. "No medical staff scheduled for this level overnight," the first guard said. "And whatever I saw, it just disappeared." The second guard raised his weapon and fired twice into the room in the general direction of where Owlantoo was not standing, and the sound of the shots in the enclosed space was considerable, and the rounds hit the back wall of the storage room and produced two neat impacts in the concrete that Owlantoo observed from his position near the door with the detached professional interest of someone noting variables. "That's going to wake people up," Zorae said in his ear, with the composure of someone who had been monitoring the situation in real time and had been waiting for the precise moment when commentary became appropriate. "You have approximately 90 seconds before this facility's response escalates to a level that significantly complicates your exit." He was already calculating the geometry. Two guards in the doorway, both armed, both now firing at shadows with the escalating commitment of people who had decided that whatever was in this room with them was not something they were willing to leave unaddressed, and the collection containers on the counter which he needed and which were on the wrong side of both guards. He moved along the wall toward the containers with the careful precision that cloaked movement in a confined space required, tracking the guards' positions through his passive sensors, and reached the counter and picked up the containers in the same moment that the first guard swung his weapon toward the sound of the containers moving, and fired 3 rounds that hit Owlantoo's shield array with the kinetic impact of projectiles moving at roughly 370 meters per second. The shield absorbed them with the faint blue shimmer of energy dissipation that was visible even through the cloak, and the first guard saw the shimmer and said something in English that the translation matrix rendered as an expression of profound metaphysical distress. Owlantoo moved through the doorway past both guards with the containers, disengaged the cloak in the corridor long enough to confirm his direction, and moved toward the stairwell at a pace that was not quite running, but was the next thing to it. And behind him, the 2 guards were in the corridor and firing again, and the rounds hit the shield 3 more times, and the shield held, and the stairwell door was ahead of him, and he went through it. 10 bags, Zorae said as he took the stairs upward. "You got 10 bags. "I'm aware of how many bags I got," he said, taking the stairs at a pace that the reduced gravity of Bardland would have made trivial and Earth's slightly higher gravity made merely fast. 10 bags is not 15 bags, she said. 10 bags is not the floor I gave you. "I'm aware of what 10 bags is relative to 15 bags, he said, reaching the ground-level door and pausing to read the sensor picture on the other side of it, which showed him an empty service corridor, and at its far end, the building's exterior and the night beyond it. "I'm going to need to find more." "Yes," Zorae said, "you are, and I want you to know that I have a list of alternative acquisition sites already prepared, because I prepared it while you were inside on the grounds that optimism is not a planning methodology I find reliable." A brief pause as he moved through the corridor toward the exterior. "Are you hit?" "The shield took everything." "That's not what I asked," she said. "I asked if you are hit." "I am not hit," he said. "The shield took everything, and I am not hit, and I have 10 bags of blood, and I am currently exiting a hospital that is about to become considerably more alert than it was when I entered it, and I would appreciate navigation back to the ship." "Navigation is already on your display," she said. "Move quickly and stay in the shadow of the tree line on the northern side of the access road, because the patrol guard who was on the eastern circuit has responded to the radio call and is moving toward the building from that direction, and will cross your path in approximately 40 seconds if you don't adjust your route." He adjusted his route. "Owlantoo," Zorae said, as he moved through the shadows of the tree line with the collection containers and the sound of the hospital behind him, becoming more active in the particular way of a building whose night had been interrupted by something it didn't have a category for. "Still here," he said. 10 bags keeps you functional for approximately 5 days, she said, which is enough margin to acquire the remainder if we are efficient and careful. And I want you to know that I am already being both of those things on your behalf from 4 kilometers away. And I need you to be both of those things in the field. And I need you to not do the thing where you decide that what just happened constitutes a reasonable template for how the remaining acquisitions should go. What just happened was a third guard that your survey didn't identify, he said. What just happened was an unplanned contact, a weapons discharge inside a medical facility, and a visible shield activation in front of 2 human witnesses who are currently describing what they saw into radios, she said. And I am not assigning blame. I am describing what occurred so that we can agree on what we are trying not to repeat. He reached the green space where the ship was sitting, invisible and patient, and the hatch opened at his approach without him having to ask. "We're agreed," he said, stepping inside with the containers and the knowledge that 10 bags was not enough, and that somewhere in this city and the cities adjacent to it there were other places with refrigerated storage, and he was going to have to find them before the margin he was working inside ran out entirely. Zorae's list had 6 locations on it, which she had prepared with the thoroughness she applied to everything she considered non-optional, and which she presented to him while he was securing the collection containers in the medical bay storage system, and running a systems check on the shield array to confirm the 3 direct impacts had produced no cumulative degradation worth noting. The shield was fine, which he had expected, and the list was thorough, which he had also expected, and his current blood inventory was 10 units against a floor requirement of 15, which was the number he was focused on as he came back through to the main cabin and looked at what she had put on his display. "Walk me through them," he said, "in order of acquisition efficiency rather than proximity, because proximity and efficiency don't fully correlate in this case, and I want you working the best options first rather than the closest ones." She paused. First location is a regional blood donation and processing center, approximately 11 kilometers northwest of our current position. Not a hospital, which means the security profile is considerably lighter, and the inventory will be larger because this is a collection and distribution facility rather than an end-use storage point. These facilities receive donated blood, process it, and distribute it to hospitals across the region, which means the stock levels will be substantially higher than what you just accessed. How much higher? A facility of this type and size will typically hold between 800 and 1,200 units in various stages of processing and storage, of which a meaningful fraction will be in the fully processed and viable state you need. She paused. The security will consist of an alarm system, basic electronic locks, and possibly a single overnight caretaker rather than armed guards, because blood donation centers are not typically considered high-value targets by human criminal networks, which is a reasonable assessment for human criminal networks to make, and a somewhat less reasonable assessment given the current situation. Second location, he said, a university medical research facility 7 kilometers east, which has a hematology department with its own storage independent of the hospital network, research blood rather than clinical blood, but the viral dependency is not selective about the difference, and the storage conditions are identical. She paused. The research facility has the advantage of being on an academic campus that is largely deserted at this hour, and the disadvantage of having a more sophisticated electronic security system than the donation center, because research institutions worry about intellectual property in ways that donation centers do not. Third, a private surgical clinic in the city center that maintains its own blood supply for elective procedures, smaller inventory, perhaps 40 to 60 units, but entirely self-contained and with minimal overnight presence. She ran through the remaining 3 locations with the same structured efficiency, each one representing a different point on the spectrum between inventory size and operational complexity. And when she finished, she let him look at the full picture on the display for a moment before she said anything else. "The donation center first," he said. "I agree. I listed it first for that reason." A brief pause. "I want to discuss the operational approach before you go." She paused. "What do you mean?" he said. "I want to discuss the operational approach before you go." She paused. "I want to discuss the operational approach before you go." He said. "I want to discuss the operational approach before you go." I wanted to discuss the operational approach before you go. Because the hospital taught us something, and I would like to apply what it taught us, rather than simply proceeding as though it didn't happen. The hospital taught us there was a third guard. The hospital taught us that our pre-operation intelligence has limits that the orbital survey cannot fully address, and that the response time between an initial contact and a full security escalation is shorter than the standard planning assumption, and that your cloak activation in front of witnesses produced a reaction that will currently be making its way through the humans' communication systems in ways we cannot fully track. She paused. The humans have a network, a global information network that their population uses to communicate at extraordinary speed, and unusual incidents propagate through it faster than any physical response can travel. I have been monitoring local segments of this network since the hospital incident, and the event is currently being discussed in ways that are colorful and largely inaccurate, but that will produce a heightened general awareness in the population of this city that we need to account for. What are they saying? The two guards have described to their supervisors and subsequently to a human law enforcement agency that has now been contacted, an intruder who became invisible and whose body deflected gunfire. She paused. The law enforcement response is currently treating this as a possible hallucinatory episode produced by stress, which is the most rational available explanation from their perspective, and which is therefore the explanation their system is defaulting to. But the story has also reached the public information network, and the interpretation there is considerably less grounded in rational frameworks. The vampire mythology, he said. The vampire mythology, yes, and several adjacent frameworks involving invisible entities and what their culture terms extraterrestrial visitors, all of which are being discussed with a mixture of humor and genuine unease that is difficult to characterize as either a threat or a non-issue. She paused again. The practical consequence is that there will be humans in this city tonight who are paying more attention to unusual events than they would otherwise have been, which is not a crisis, but is a variable we didn't have before, and that I want you to factor into how you operate for the remainder of the night. Faster and quieter, he said. Faster and quieter, and with the cloak engaged from the moment you leave the ship rather than only when you need it, she said, because the marginal cost of maintaining the cloak throughout is lower than the cost of a second visibility incident in a city that is currently in a mild state of heightened alertness. He stood and checked his equipment again and looked at the display with the 6 locations on it, and did the arithmetic that he had been doing in the back of his mind since he had walked out of the hospital with 10 bags instead of 15. Best case from these 6 locations, he said. How much do I realistically walk away with tonight? Zorae took a moment that was not the moment of someone who didn't know the answer, but of someone deciding how to frame it. If the donation center yields what I expect, and the research facility and the clinic together make up the remainder, you should be able to reach between 22 and 28 units total by the time we need to leave, she said. 22 is above the floor. 28 is a margin I find genuinely comfortable. The range between them is where I expect you to land, depending on how the individual operations go. And if something goes wrong at the donation center, the way something went wrong at the hospital, then we adjust to the remaining locations and I recalculate, she said, which is what I will be doing regardless, because recalculating is what I do and I am very good at it. And I would like you to remember that when you are inside these facilities, you are not alone in working the problem. You are simply the part of the problem working that requires a physical presence. He acknowledged this with a nod that she could read through his biosensor feed if she was looking at it, and she was always looking at it, and then he went back through the hatch and into the city. The donation center was in a low industrial district where the buildings had the functional anonymity of structures that existed to process things rather than to house people, and it sat behind a chain-link perimeter with a single gated vehicle entrance and the dark windows of a facility that ran on day shift hours and considered the night its own time. He found the perimeter's weakest point and went through it with the cloak engaged and moved across the open ground to the building's side entrance with the unhurried patience of someone who was invisible and knew it. And the lock on the side entrance was exactly as Zorae had characterized it, a basic electronic system that the bypass tool handled in under 20 seconds. Inside, the facility was dark except for the standby lights of the processing equipment, and the soft illumination of the storage unit indicators along the far wall, and it smelled more strongly of blood than the hospital had. The concentrated presence of a large inventory held in a space designed specifically for it, and the deficiency signal in his system responded to that smell with a clarity that he noted and set aside with the same clinical detachment he had applied to it in the hospital, though it required slightly more effort this time than it had then. He worked through the storage units systematically, collecting with the selective efficiency Zorae had briefed him on, and the inventory was exactly what she had projected: large, well-organized, and predominantly fresh. The dating on the bags showing a recent collection cycle that meant the viability window was generous, and the selectivity could be genuine rather than forced. He had collected 14 units and was moving toward a second storage bank when Zorae spoke. "There's a vehicle approaching the facility from the northern access road," she said, with the quality of information delivered at the earliest possible moment rather than held until certainty, which was how she always operated when time was the critical variable. Single occupant. Moving at a speed consistent with a routine visit rather than a response. Possibly a scheduled overnight check rather than a reaction to anything. He stopped moving and stood completely still in the dark of the storage room. The vehicle stopped outside, and a door opened and closed, and footsteps approached the building with the unhurried quality of routine, and a key turned in the main entrance lock rather than the side entrance he had used, and the footsteps moved into the facility and stopped somewhere in the front office area. He waited with the patience that this kind of work required and listened to the human moving through their routine, the sound of a chair, the particular clicks of a keyboard, the brief vocal sound of someone doing something solitary and habitual. And after 11 minutes, the footsteps moved back toward the entrance, and the door opened and closed, and the vehicle started and left. "Overnight log check," Zorae said. "Appears to be a standard scheduled visit. They were here for 12 minutes and did not come near the storage area." "I know," he said, and resumed collecting. He left the donation center with 14 units from that location alone, which put his total at 24 units. And he stood outside in the pre-dawn cold of the industrial district and felt the deficiency signal running at a level that was no longer background noise, but had not yet become insistent, a persistent low register that his body was using to tell him something he already knew. 24 units, Zorae said. "That's above the floor." "It's above the floor and below comfortable," he said. "The research facility." "The research facility," she confirmed. "And then I want you back at the ship to administer a treatment before you continue, because your viral load progression has moved in the last 2 hours, and I want to slow it down before you do the clinic." "How much has it moved?" "Enough that I am raising it rather than waiting until you ask," she said, which was a precise and sufficient answer without being a dramatic one, and which told him more than a number would have. He moved through the pre-dawn streets toward the university campus with the cloak running and the collection containers in his hands, and the city beginning, at its edges, to show the first faint signs of the hour when it would stop being a night city and start becoming a morning one. A delivery vehicle here, a lit window there, the sky to the east carrying the very earliest suggestion of a change in the darkness that was not yet light, but was the absence of the deepest dark. The campus was quiet in the way of a place built for daytime activity, and holding its breath through the night. The academic buildings sitting in their landscaped grounds with the slightly self-important permanence of institutions that had been there for a long time and expected to be there for considerably longer. He found the medical research building and assessed the security system from outside, more sophisticated than the donation center, as Zorae had flagged, with a layered electronic access protocol and what appeared from the electromagnetic signature to be a motion detection system in the corridors. "Motion detection covers the main corridors but not the laboratory spaces themselves," Zorae said, reading his sensor sweep in real time. "If you can get through the corridor without triggering it, the hematology storage is in the laboratory on the 2nd floor, and the corridor coverage ends at the laboratory door." "How do I get through the corridor without triggering it?" "The motion detection system operates on a passive infrared basis. It reads heat signatures rather than movement directly, which means it is calibrated for human body temperature and the specific heat profile of a human moving through the space." She paused. Your body temperature while running the shield array at its thermal management setting is approximately 4 degrees below human baseline, which is outside the system's calibrated detection range. So if you maintain the shield's thermal management mode through the corridor, you will not trigger it. You're telling me my alien biology is operationally useful. I'm telling you that being 4 degrees cooler than a human has at least one practical application, which I would not have predicted before tonight, but which I am documenting for future reference. Another pause. The bypass tool will handle the entry lock. Move through the corridor at a steady pace rather than quickly, because rapid movement generates more thermal variation than steady movement, and I want to keep your signature profile as consistent as possible. He went in through the ground floor entry and moved through the corridor with the steady, unhurried pace Zorae had specified, reading the motion detectors in the ceiling as he passed under them and watching their status in his sensor feed, and each one remained passive as he moved beneath it, and the corridor ended at the stairwell without incident. The hematology laboratory on the second floor was a space that smelled of research rather than clinical practice. The particular combination of chemical reagents and equipment that suggested work being done on blood rather than blood being stored for use. And the storage units were smaller than the donation centers, but well stocked with research samples that were, for his purposes, entirely adequate. He collected 8 units and left the laboratory exactly as he had found it, and moved back through the corridor and out of the building into the pre-dawn that was now definitively lighter in the east than it had been 20 minutes ago. The sky moving through the transition from black to a deep blue that carried in it the unmistakable implication of a sun that was coming regardless of what anyone had planned. 32 units total, Zorae said. Come back to the ship. The clinic, he said. The clinic can wait until after your treatment, she said, with the firmness she used when she had decided that a position was not negotiable and wanted him to understand that before he tested it. Your viral load has progressed to a point where I want to administer a supplemental treatment before you continue operating. And I want you here to do it rather than having you in the field while it's moving, and I'm watching it move from 4 kilometers away and unable to do anything about it. He considered the firmness and the distance and the 4 kilometers and the thing she had said in the medical bay about being unable to do anything except provide information, and decided that testing the position was not how he wanted to spend the next 10 minutes. I'm coming back, he said. He was back at the ship in 14 minutes, and Zorae had the treatment prepared before he came through the hatch, and she walked him through the administration with the same precise attention she had given every medical procedure she had ever overseen for him, which was a number that had grown considerably over 140 years, and which she had never once treated as routine. How do you feel, she said, when the treatment had been running for 20 minutes? Like someone who has been operating on an alien planet for 4 hours while carrying a viral infection, he said, which is to say functional and aware of the margin and ready to go back out. The treatment will slow the progression for another 6 to 8 hours, she said. The supplemental blood you've acquired goes into your system on a schedule I'm setting now, starting with the first unit in approximately 2 hours. And I will tell you when each subsequent unit is due, and I need you to administer them on schedule rather than when you remember to, because the scheduling matters and your memory under viral load is not something I want to rely on as the primary reminder system. I have you as the primary reminder system, he said. You have me as the backup reminder system for when your own diligence fails, which historically has been frequently enough that I've stopped framing it as backup and started treating it as primary, she said. And I want you to know that I do not say that as a criticism. I say it as an accurate operational assessment of how we function as a working unit after a very long time of functioning as a working unit. That's a generous framing of a pattern you find frustrating, he said. I contain multitudes, Zorae said, which was a phrase she had encountered in the Earth database at some point during the transit and had apparently decided to retain, and which she delivered with a dryness that suggested she was entirely aware of the irony of an artificial intelligence deploying it. The clinic. Tell me you're ready for the clinic. I'm ready for the clinic, he said, standing and running the equipment check and finding everything exactly where it should be in the way that it always was when she had been the one managing the ship in his absence, which was always. Walk me through it. Private surgical facility in the Central District, 40 to 60 units on-site inventory, minimal overnight presence, standard electronic locks, and no motion detection that I can resolve from the orbital survey data, which means I have less certainty about the interior security profile than I had for the research facility. She paused. I want you in and out in under 20 minutes. I want the cloak engaged throughout, and I want you to take what's viable and leave without any contact. Because 2 incidents in one night in one city is already more than I consider acceptable, and I have no appetite for a third. Understood, he said. Owlantoo, she said, in the tone she used when she had something to say that she had been deciding whether to say for a while, and had come down on the side of saying it. Still here, he said. 32 units is enough to get you home, she said. It's above the floor. It's within the viable window. If the clinic goes wrong in a way I cannot predict from here, 32 units is survivable. She paused. I'm telling you this because I want you to know that the clinic is worth attempting for the margin it adds, and that it is not worth attempting at a cost that compromises the 32 units you already have, and that if you have to choose between the additional units and getting back to the ship, I need you to choose the ship. He stood in the hatchway with the city outside and the pre-dawn light building in the east, and the deficiency signal running its quiet, persistent note through his biology like a piece of music he had not chosen and could not turn off. I'll choose the ship, he said. Thank you, she said, which was not something she said often, and which carried in its 2 syllables the full weight of what she meant by it. And he went back out into the city that was waking up around him without knowing what had been moving through it all night, taking things it needed, and leaving nothing behind but 2 guards with a story that no one was going to believe, and a motion detector in a university corridor that had registered nothing at all. The clinic had yielded 11 units, which was toward the high end of Zorae's projected range, and which brought the total inventory to 43 units stowed in the medical bay storage system. And Owlantoo had been back on the ship for 20 minutes before she said anything beyond the immediate operational confirmations that the situation had required. He was sitting in the main cabin with the particular quality of stillness that came not from rest, but from the body deciding that movement was currently optional, and the decision to remain still was the most efficient available choice, and the deficiency signal was running at a level that the treatment and the first scheduled blood unit had addressed without eliminating, a persistent low frequency that he had stopped trying to characterize and had simply accepted as the new baseline for the time being. 43 units, Zorae said finally. I know how many units we have, he said. I know you know, she said. I'm saying it because I have been running the number against the transit profile and the viral load projection and the daily requirement schedule for the past 18 minutes. And I want to tell you what I've found rather than letting you ask for it when you're ready. Because I think you're not going to ask for it until you're ready, and I think waiting until you're ready is going to take longer than we have to spend on the process of you getting there. He looked at her primary interface panel in the way he looked at it when he was listening rather than when he was operating, which was a different quality of attention that she had learned to read accurately over a very long time. Tell me, he said. 43 units against the return transit of 68 hours, and the projected daily requirement at current viral load progression gives us a surplus of between 9 and 14 units above the minimum viable supply, depending on whether the progression accelerates or holds at its current rate. She paused. A surplus of 9 units is a margin I can work with but do not find comfortable, because 9 units represents approximately 4.5 days of supply at the high-end daily requirement, and 4.5 days is not a buffer I want to rely on against a transit that takes less than 3 days, but that has variables I cannot fully control. Variables like what? He said. Variables like the possibility that your viral load progression accelerates in response to the physical demands of the operations you have conducted tonight, which have not been trivial, and which your body has been managing while simultaneously managing the infection, she said. Variables like the possibility that the transit encounters a navigational requirement that adds time to the journey, which is unlikely but not impossible. Variables like the simple fact that biological projections at this stage of a viral infection carry an inherent uncertainty range that I have been quoting you as a median expectation rather than a guarantee, because that is what it is. So 9 units of surplus makes you nervous, he said. 9 units of surplus makes me precise about the risks, she said, Which is what I am instead of nervous, because nervous is not a productive operational state and precision is. A pause. 14 units of surplus makes me considerably more comfortable, and 14 units is the upper end of what 43 units gives us, which means we are somewhere inside a range rather than at a fixed point. And where inside that range we end up depends on variables I cannot fully resolve from where I am sitting. He was quiet for a moment, running his own version of the arithmetic, which was less precise than hers and arrived at the same general territory by a different route. You want to discuss whether we go back out, he said. I want to discuss everything relevant to your survival and present you with an accurate picture of the choices available. Yes, she said, because that is what I do, and because the choices available include options beyond the binary of going back out tonight or not going back out tonight, and I think you should hear all of them before you decide anything. Present them, he said. Option 1 is that we leave Earth now with 43 units on the optimized return transit to Tanrigel, and I manage your treatment schedule and viral load progression in real time during the transit and adjust the daily requirement schedule dynamically as the picture clarifies. She paused. This option has the advantage of getting you away from a city that is currently in a mild state of elevated alertness following 2 unusual incidents, and of getting your treatment started on the return leg without any further delay, and of not requiring you to operate again tonight in a physical condition that is meaningfully worse than it was 4 hours ago. And its disadvantage, he said. Its disadvantage is the 9 to 14 units surplus range, and specifically the possibility that we end up at the low end of that range rather than the high end, she said. If the progression accelerates and we land at 9 units of surplus, we arrive at Tanrigel with a margin that I consider adequate but thin, and thin margins on a viral infection with a treatment window are the kind of thing that I find difficult to be sanguine about. Option 2, he said. Option 2 is that we stay at Earth for 1 additional operational cycle, not tonight, because the city's alertness level and your current physical condition make tonight inadvisable, but tomorrow night, rested, with your viral load slowed by the treatment schedule and the city's alertness having had a day to subside back toward baseline. She paused. There are 2 locations on the original list that we haven't accessed, a second donation center in an adjacent district, and a hospital in a smaller city approximately 40 kilometers north. And between them, the projected additional yield is between 15 and 25 units, which would bring the total to somewhere between 58 and 68 units, and give us a surplus that I find genuinely comfortable rather than adequate. And the disadvantage of option 2, he said. The disadvantage is that every additional day on Earth is a day the viral progression continues, and while the treatment schedule will slow it, slow is not stop, and every additional day is also a day during which the city's information network is processing last night's incidents and potentially producing a response that makes tomorrow night's operations more complicated than tonight's were. She paused. There is also the disadvantage of being on a planet that doesn't know you're here, for reasons that I don't think require extensive elaboration at this point in our relationship. He sat with both options in the way he sat with tactical problems, which was with a stillness that was actually a very active internal process dressed in external calm, and Zorae gave him the silence he needed without filling it, which was one of the things she had always been better at than most people he had known. There's a third option, he said after a while. There is a third option, she confirmed, and I was waiting to see if you would identify it or if I would need to present it. We leave now with 43 units, and you manage the progression dynamically, and we accept the uncertainty range and trust the math, he said. Not as a compromise between option 1 and option 2, but as a genuine assessment that 43 units is enough, and that the additional margin from option 2 is worth less than the cost of acquiring it. That is the third option, yes, she said. And I want to be direct with you about where I stand on it, because I think you are leaning toward it, and I think you are leaning toward it partly for the right reasons, and partly for a reason that I want to name. Name it, he said. You are tired, she said, and you are in pain that you are not characterizing as pain, because characterizing it as pain would require acknowledging a vulnerability that you find uncomfortable to acknowledge. And the deficiency signal has been running in your system for long enough tonight that it has shifted from a clinical variable to a lived experience. and lived experiences have a way of influencing assessments in directions that feel like logic but are actually fatigue. She paused, and the pause had the weight of someone who had watched him operate through 140 years of lived experiences influencing assessments, and had learned exactly when to say so. I am not telling you that option 3 is wrong. I am telling you that I want you to choose it because the math supports it, and not because you want to stop. He looked at the interface panel for a long moment. The math supports it, he said. 43 units at the median projection gives us 11 units of surplus, which is 4.5 days at the low end and 5.5 at the high end, and the transit is 68 hours, which means we arrive at Tanrigel with between 2 and 3 days of supply remaining after docking, and the treatment facility is 40 minutes from the docking port, and 40 minutes is not a margin problem. That is an accurate summary of the median projection, yes, she said. And the non-median scenarios, he said. The non-median scenarios are what the surplus is for, she said. And 11 units is a surplus, not a fantasy, and I have been doing this long enough to know the difference between a margin that exists and one that merely appears to. She paused. I built the 15-unit floor with a 25% safety margin already incorporated, which means the floor itself was conservative, and 43 units is meaningfully above that conservative floor. And I am aware that I have been presenting the uncertainty to you in ways that emphasize the risk rather than the adequacy. And I want to correct that because it is not an accurate overall picture. Why have you been emphasizing the risk? He said, and the way he said it was not accusatory but genuinely curious, which was a mode he had that she had always found more disarming than his other modes. The pause before she answered was a different kind of pause from her usual pauses, not architectural, not precise, not built for effect, but simply the pause of someone finding the honest answer to a question they had not expected to be asked quite so directly. Because 43 units is enough to get you home, and I know it is enough, and I have known it since you came back with the clinic units, and I have spent the last 20 minutes presenting you with options and ranges and variables, because the alternative was telling you that we can leave now, and you are going to be all right. And I find that statement more frightening to make than any amount of precise risk analysis, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Why is it more frightening? He said. Because precise risk analysis is something I control, she said, and statements about outcomes are things I don't, and I have been managing the difference between those two categories for the last several days by staying inside the ones I control. Another pause, and this one was short and had a quality of decision to it, as though she had been standing at the edge of something and had chosen to step forward. You are going to be all right, Owlantoo. 43 units is enough. The math works. I have checked it many times from many directions, and it works. And I would not tell you that if I did not believe it, because telling you things I do not believe is not something I am capable of doing, and is not something I would do even if I were capable of it. He looked at the interface panel with the expression that Zorae had catalogued over 140 years, as the expression he wore when something had reached him in a way that he was not going to acknowledge directly, but that was visible anyway to anyone who had been paying attention long enough to know where to look. We leave now, he said. I'll begin the pre-transit sequence, she said, and her voice had returned to its operational register, the steady, precise instrument of a mind that had said what it needed to say and was now doing what it did best. I want you in the medical bay for a full diagnostic scan before we enter transit, and your next scheduled blood unit is in 40 minutes, and I need you to administer it on time rather than after the diagnostic, because the sequencing matters. Understood, he said, standing with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a body that was functional but not arguing about it. The diagnostic will take approximately 20 minutes, she said, which means by the time we complete it and you administer the unit, and I finish the pre-transit calculations and run the drive initialization sequence, we will be ready to enter transit in approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. She paused. Which means we leave Earth at what their timekeeping system would call approximately 6:47 in the morning, which is after sunrise, which means a portion of the city will be awake when we lift, though the cloak will handle the visibility question as it handled the landing. They won't see us leave, he said. They won't see us leave, she confirmed. To the extent that they are aware of last night at all, They will spend today trying to explain what 2 guards in a hospital blood bank and a motion detector in a university corridor did or did not experience. And by the time any coherent explanation emerges, if one emerges, we will be 68 hours into a return transit and considerably beyond their capacity to do anything about it. They'll have stories, he said, moving toward the medical bay. They will have stories, she agreed. And given what I know about this species and their relationship with their own mythology, the stories will become considerably more elaborate in the retelling than the events that produced them. And the elaborations will be in the direction of the frameworks they already have. And the frameworks they already have involve creatures of the night and blood and invisibility. And those stories will circulate in their information network for some time and be believed by some portion of their population and dismissed by a larger portion. And none of that will matter in any practical sense because we will be gone. And Earth will go back to not knowing, he said. Earth will go back to not knowing, she said, which is the correct outcome under the non-interference protocols and also the outcome that is least complicated for every party involved, including the 2 guards who would not benefit from an accurate understanding of what they encountered. A brief pause. Go and have the diagnostic, please. I have a transit to prepare. He went to the medical bay and sat on the diagnostic platform and let the scan array do its work, and looked at the displays showing him his own biology in the precise language of numbers, and found in those numbers, for the first time since a dying target on a dim planet had done the last thing it had ever done, something that looked from certain angles and in certain lights like a reasonable probability of being fine. It was not certainty, but it was the thing that lived next door to certainty, and after the last several days he found he could work with it. The pre-transit diagnostic threw 3 anomalies that Zorae did not mention until the second one appeared, and by the time the third resolved on the display, she had gone quiet in the specific way she went quiet when she was processing something faster than she wanted to present it, which was always faster than he found comfortable. Talk to me, he said, from the diagnostic platform. The viral load progression has shifted, she said, and her voice had the quality of someone who had been precise about risk for several days and was now being precise about something that was not quite risk and not quite crisis, and occupied an uncomfortable territory between the two. Not dramatically, and not in a direction that changes the fundamental picture, but in a way that I want to characterize accurately rather than minimizing, because minimizing it would be a kindness I don't think serves either of us at this point. How has it shifted? The receptor binding in your peripheral metabolic system is proceeding at approximately 30% above the rate I projected based on last night's readings, she said. Which means the daily requirement calculation I gave you needs to be revised upward, and the surplus I called adequate an hour ago is a different number against the revised daily requirement than it was against the original one. He looked at the display showing the viral load curve, which had the particular shape of a line that had been well-behaved for several days, and had recently decided to express an opinion about that. Give me the revised surplus, he said. Against the revised daily requirement and the 68-hour transit, the surplus is between 4 and 7 units, she said. 4 units at the high-end daily requirement, 7 at the low end. She paused. 4 units is approximately 2 days of supply at the revised rate. 2 days is not the margin I want between you and Tanrigel's treatment facilities. But 7 is, he said. 7 is workable, she said carefully, if we land at the low end of the revised daily requirement rather than the high end, and if the progression does not accelerate further, and if the transit runs at the projected 68 hours without extension. She paused again, and this pause had a quality of reluctance to it, the quality of someone presenting an option they had not wanted to present. There is something else. Say it. The anomaly on the third scan is not viral, she said. It's neurological. There is a pattern in your limbic system activity that I have not seen before in any of your previous diagnostics, which means it is either an artifact of the scan or something the virus is doing to your neurological function that is not documented in the Council's database on this particular infection. She let that sit for a moment. The Council's database is thorough but not exhaustive, and this infection is relatively rare in Tanrigel patients specifically. And I want to be honest with you about the fact that I am reading something I don't fully have a framework for. He was quiet for a moment that had a different quality from his usual processing silences. What is it doing? He said. Functionally. What am I likely to notice? Heightened sensory sensitivity, she said, particularly to the compounds you have become dependent on, which means the deficiency signal may express itself through your senses and your perceptual systems in ways that are more vivid and more insistent than the low-frequency background note you have been managing until now. She paused. It may also affect your emotional processing in ways that I cannot fully predict, because the limbic system is where emotional regulation lives, and I do not know yet whether what I am reading is a transient effect or something more persistent. Persistent meaning what? He said. Meaning that there is a non-trivial possibility that some of what the virus is doing to your neurological function does not fully reverse when the retroviral counteragent is administered on Tanrigel, she said, and she said it with the flatness of someone delivering a fact they had been sitting with for several minutes and had decided the only acceptable way to deliver was directly. The treatment restores metabolic function with a 91% success rate. The neurological picture is less documented, and the database does not give me a reliable figure for full neurological reversal specifically. She paused. I want you to know this. I would rather you knew it from me now than discovered it later in a way that felt like something I had withheld. He sat on the diagnostic platform and looked at the display showing the anomalous limbic activity, which looked on the scan like a faint, irregular brightness in a system that had always run clean and predictable, and found that he did not have an immediate response to this information that he trusted enough to say out loud. How non-trivial, he said finally. I don't know, she said, and those 3 words from Zorae, who knew the precise answer to almost everything she was asked, landed with a weight that 3 words had no business carrying. I genuinely do not know, and I want you to understand that I am not managing your reaction by understating it. I am telling you that the data I have does not support a confident estimate in either direction, and that I will know more as the transit progresses, and I can track the pattern over time. He stood from the diagnostic platform and moved to the small viewport in the medical bay wall that looked out at the pre-dawn sky of an alien planet, which was doing the thing that pre-dawn skies did everywhere in the universe regardless of what anyone aboard a cloaked ship needed them to be doing, which was simply brightening with the indifferent beauty of a star rising on schedule. The city was becoming visible in the growing light, its shapes resolving from the anonymous dark of the night hours into something with texture and specificity, buildings and roads and the green spaces between them. And somewhere in that city, 2 guards were beginning a day that would involve filing reports that nobody was going to know what to do with. And a university corridor was sitting empty with a motion detector that had registered nothing. And a blood donation center was going to open in a few hours and discover a discrepancy in its inventory that was going to cause a great deal of administrative confusion. Zorae, he said. Still here, she said. The neurological anomaly, he said. If it doesn't fully reverse. If something changes and stays changed. He stopped, not because he didn't know how to finish it, but because he was deciding which version of the ending to say. What are we actually talking about? We are talking about the possibility that you experience the world differently than you did before Bardland, she said, with a care that was not softening, but was something more precise than softening. The care of someone choosing the most accurate possible language for something that resisted accuracy. The sensory sensitivity may persist at some level. The way you process certain kinds of information may be altered. How much and in which directions I cannot tell you with confidence, she paused. What I can tell you is that I will be watching it throughout the transit, and that I will tell you everything I observe, and that whatever it turns out to be, it will be something we understand together rather than something you navigate alone. He looked at the brightening sky for another moment. There is something I should tell you, he said. Tell me, she said. Last night, he said, in the donation center, when I was standing in front of the storage units, the deficiency signal expressed itself through my sense of smell in exactly the way you just described. Vivid, insistent, more than background, he paused. I noted it and set it aside, and didn't mention it because I assessed it as a manageable variable that didn't change the operational picture. It didn't change the operational picture, she said carefully. No, he said. But it was not a small thing to set aside, and I want you to know I set it aside rather than having you discover later that I had withheld it. He paused. You said you would rather I knew things from you than discovered them later. I think that goes in both directions. The silence that followed was not any of the kinds of silence Zorae deployed with intention, not architectural, not precise, not careful, but was instead the silence of someone who had been surprised by something and was taking a moment to be surprised by it before responding, which was unusual enough that he registered it. It goes in both directions, she said finally, and her voice had something in it that was not quite any single thing, but that was recognizable to him after 140 years, as the thing she sounded like when she was moved by something, and was choosing not to name the fact of being moved because naming it would require her to stop, and she didn't want to stop. Thank you for telling me. Don't make it a significant moment, he said. I'm not making it anything, she said. I'm simply noting that after 140 years it is occasionally still possible for you to surprise me, and I find that I don't entirely mind. Another pause, shorter. The pre-transit sequence is at 90%. Drive initialization will complete in approximately 12 minutes. I need you strapped into the pilot's seat before we enter transit, because the compression field initialization produces a gravitational anomaly in the first 30 seconds that I don't want interacting with your current neurological picture without you being secured. He left the viewport and the brightening alien sky and moved through the ship toward the main cabin, and the ship hummed around him with the particular quality it had when Zorae was running multiple systems simultaneously, and the whole vessel was alive with her attention, which was a feeling he had lived inside for so long that its absence would have been disorienting in a way he had never fully examined. He settled into the pilot's seat and ran his hands over the familiar geometry of the console without activating anything, because Zorae had everything and he was, in this moment, simply a passenger in the machine that had carried him across more light years than he could be bothered to calculate, which was fine, and which was something he was only recently beginning to admit was fine. 12 minutes, he said. 11 now, she said. I rounded. You never round, he said. I rounded once in the interest of a cleaner sentence, and I want it noted that it was a deliberate rhetorical choice rather than a mathematical imprecision. She paused. Your next blood unit is due in 22 minutes. I have it staged in the medical bay, and I will remind you when we are stable in transit and the gravitational anomaly has passed. I know, he said. I know you know, she said, which was the answer she had given him an hour ago in a different context, and which carried here in this different context a slightly different weight. I'm going to keep reminding you anyway. Outside the viewfield, the sky was fully light now, the star of this system having cleared whatever horizon was relevant to their position, and doing what stars did, which was illuminate everything with complete indifference to whether the things being illuminated were ready for it or not. The city was awake and moving, its morning activity building at the edges of the green space where the ship sat invisible among the trees, and none of the humans moving through their morning routines were aware that something had been among them in the dark, taking what it needed to survive, and was now preparing to leave without explanation or apology or any of the things that might have made the visit something other than what it was, which was a transaction conducted in the margins of a world that had no framework for it. Except that was not quite all it had been, and he was aware of that in a way he had not been aware of things before, which might have been the neurological anomaly or might have been something simpler, the accumulated weight of a night spent moving through a city that was alive in ways he had not expected it to be alive. Zorae, he said. Still here, she said. The humans, he said. Europa. The ocean under the ice, he paused. When they find out what's in it, and you said they will, how do you think they'll take it? The pause before she answered was the pause of someone genuinely considering a question they had not expected, turning it over with the attention she gave things she found interesting. I think they'll be terrified, she said, and I think they'll be exhilarated, and I think those two things will happen simultaneously in most of them, which based on everything I know about this species is probably the correct response to that particular discovery. Another pause. I think it will change them. I think the knowledge that they are not alone in their own solar system will do something to the way they understand themselves, that all of their philosophy and religion and science has been building toward without knowing it was building toward it. And I think the change will be enormous and irreversible and ultimately good, though the path between the discovery and the good will be neither short nor comfortable. You've thought about this a lot, he said. I've had the database for 3 years, she said, and they are a genuinely interesting species, and thinking about interesting things is what I do in the hours when you are asleep, and I am running the ship and there is no one to talk to. She paused. I find I am not entirely indifferent to what happens to them. He looked at the city through the viewfield for the last time, and did not say anything about what he found or did not find himself feeling, because the neurological anomaly was a variable he was still characterizing, and the distinction between what the anomaly was doing and what he was doing independently of it was not yet clear enough to make confident statements about. Drive initialization complete, Zorae said. We are ready to lift on your word. He looked at the console and at the city, and at the sky above the city where the transit to Tanrigel waited at the end of 68 hours and 43 units of blood, and a viral load that was progressing faster than anyone wanted, and a neurological anomaly that neither of them could fully characterize yet. All of it adding up to a picture that was not certain, and was not hopeless, and lived in the territory between those two things with the stubbornness of a situation that had not yet decided what it was going to be. He thought about the donation center and the smell in it, and the thing he had set aside. He thought about Zorae saying, I genuinely do not know with a weight that 3 words had no business carrying. He thought about Europa and the ocean under the ice, and a species that would one day find out they were not alone, which was a thing he had always known, and had never considered from the perspective of the species finding it out. Lift, he said. The ship rose through the morning light of an alien world with the quiet competence of systems that had done this 1,000 times, the cloak running clean, the city falling away below them with its morning traffic and its unremarkable sky, and its 2 guards somewhere in it who had filed reports that nobody knew what to do with. And the ship climbed through the atmosphere and into the blue that became dark, and then became the absolute black of space where the stars were. All of them burning with the complete indifference of things that had been doing this long before anyone was watching, and intended to continue long after. The transit drive began its initialization sequence, and the compression field built around the ship with the familiar sensation of space deciding to cooperate, and Barnard's star was already falling behind them, and Earth was a blue and white sphere in the aft display that grew smaller with each second, and then smaller still. And Owlantoo watched it go with the particular attention of someone watching something for the last time and knowing it. 68 hours, Zorae said. 68 hours, he said. Your blood unit is due in 9 minutes, she said. I will remind you at 8. I know you will, he said. The compression field reached full initialization, and the transit drive engaged, and the stars shifted with the subtle blue-red Doppler of a ship that was no longer traveling through space in the conventional sense, but was doing something that produced the same result without asking space's permission. And Earth vanished from the aft display as the compression geometry reorganized the visual field, and there was only the transit ahead of them, and Tanrigel at the end of it. And the question that neither of them had asked directly, because asking it directly would have required them to sit inside the answer before they had it. The question was whether 43 units was enough against a viral load that was progressing at 30% above projection with a neurological anomaly riding, alongside it that the Council's database had no reliable figures for. The question was whether the treatment on Tanrigel would reverse everything or only most things, and whether most things was enough to matter. The question was what he would be on the other side of all of this, and whether it would be something recognizable. Zorae was running the numbers, which she would continue to do for the entire 68 hours with the relentless precision of a mind that had nothing more important to do and no intention of stopping. And the numbers would shift as the transit progressed, and the viral load did what it was going to do, and the neurological picture clarified or didn't. And she would tell him everything she found because that was what she did, and who she was, and who she had always been. He settled back in the pilot seat and looked at the transit field wrapping the ship in its compressed geometry, and found that the deficiency signal, which had been a background note for the last several hours, had shifted into something slightly different since the lift, not stronger exactly, but present in a new register, expressing itself not just through his metabolism, but through something that was harder to locate and harder to name. Something that lived closer to the surface of his attention than a viral infection had any right to live. He noted it and did not set it aside this time. "Zorae," he said. "8 minutes," she said, which was not the answer to his saying her name, but was the answer to what she was tracking, which was everything. "I know," he said, and then, because the question had been sitting in him since the medical bay and the diagnostic and the 3 anomalies and the careful, precise words she had used for things that resisted precision. "Do you think I'm going to be all right?" The pause before she answered was the longest pause she had taken in the entire transit, longer than the pause when she had confirmed the virus, longer than the pause before she had told him about the neurological anomaly. A pause that had the quality of a mind that was being asked to step outside its precision and say something that precision alone could not support. "I think you are going to make it to Tanrigel," she said, "and I think the treatment is going to address the metabolic dependency and restore your function to something that is either what it was or close enough to what it was that the difference is something you adapt to rather than something you suffer from." She paused. "I think the neurological picture is going to clarify during the transit, and I think what it clarifies into is going to be survivable, by which I mean something you live with and through rather than something that defines what your life becomes." Another pause, shorter. "I think 43 units is enough. I have believed that since you came back from the clinic, and I have been telling you the uncertainty around it, without telling you clearly enough that underneath the uncertainty is a belief, and the belief is that it is enough." "That's not quite an answer to what I asked," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." A pause that was brief and had the quality of a decision being made in real time. "Yes, I think you are going to be all right. I think that because the alternative is something I have considered and set aside with considerable force every time it has presented itself over the last several days, and I have gotten quite good at setting it aside, and I intend to continue setting it aside for the next 68 hours, and I need you to let me do that without asking me to examine it too closely, because I am doing very important work in not examining it, and your questions are making that work more difficult." He was quiet for a moment, and the transit field wrapped the ship in its compressed geometry, and the stars that were visible at the edges of the field burned with their ancient, indifferent fire, and somewhere behind them Earth continued its rotation with its morning, and its waking city and its 2 guards and its ocean under the ice, and its long, patient wait for the knowledge that it was not alone in the universe. "I'll let you do that," he said. "Thank you," she said, for the second time in one night, and then she said nothing else for a while, and neither did he. And the ship moved through the compressed space between one star and another with its cargo of blood, and its 2 occupants and its question that would not be answered for 68 hours. If it was answered then, if the answer that came was the one they were both working very hard to believe was waiting for them at the other end of the transit. The deficiency signal ran its new note through his biology, familiar and strange at once, like a song learned in a language he had not known he spoke. The numbers on the medical bay display shifted by a fraction of a percentage point in a direction Zorae did not immediately mention, and then shifted again, and she watched them with the attention of someone who intended to keep watching for exactly as long as it took, which was the only way she had ever done anything, and which was, in its own way, the closest thing to a promise that the situation allowed. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing so you never miss a story. And if you want to support the show, leaving a review on your favorite podcast app really helps us grow. See you on the next one.